Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still can't believe it's been over 50 years since that night in September of 1970. I was 32 then, and my sister-in-law Martha was 28. Time has a funny way of dulling most memories, but not this one. This one stays sharp, like it happened yesterday. We'd been visiting my old school friend Diane, who'd moved to a little place outside Three Lakes in Barriga County. It was one of those perfect Michigan September evenings, still warm, but with that hint of fall crispness in the air, the kind where you need a light sweater but nothing more. Diane had made her famous pot roast, and we'd stayed longer than we planned, catching up on life and sharing stories about our husbands. Her Tom and my Frank were brothers. It must have been around 10 o'clock when we finally said our goodbyes. Martha and I both had work the next morning, and it was at least an hour drive back home along Highway 37. If you've never been on that stretch of road, especially back then, let me tell you, it's about as remote as they come, miles of nothing but pine trees, hills, and the occasional glimpse of stars through the canopy when the road opens up a bit. Martha was driving her husband's Chevy Impala that night. I remember because she was always so proud of that car, kept it spotless inside and out. We had the windows cracked open since it was such a nice night, and the radio was playing softly, just some easy listening station out of Marquette. We were chatting about Diane's new curtains of all things, such a mundane conversation before everything changed. We'd been on the road maybe 20 minutes, the headlights cut through the darkness, occasionally reflecting off the eyes of some small animal in the brush. Nothing unusual, just a typical nighttime drive through the UP. The road was winding through some hills, and we were taking it slow, not another car in sight. "Did you see that?" Martha suddenly asked, her voice tight. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so hard, her knuckles went white. "See what?" I was mid-sentence about something completely trivial when she interrupted me. She slowed the car down, almost to a crawl. "There, up there on that hill to the left." I followed her gaze and at first saw nothing but darkness and the silhouettes of trees against the night sky. But then something moved, something big. "What is that?" I whispered, even though there was no need to lower my voice inside the car. The moonlight was strong that night, almost full, I think, and it illuminated something on the hillside about 50 yards from the road. Something that had no business being there. Something that made my skin prickle with a cold sweat despite the pleasant evening air. It was white. That's what struck me first, not brown or black like a bear would be. Pure white, almost glowing in the moonlight, and tall, so impossibly tall. It was standing upright on two legs, looking down at our car from its position on the hillside. "Drive," I said quietly to Martha, "and drive now." But she didn't. She just sat there, frozen, staring up at the thing, the creature. And I swear, I will swear until the day I die, it was looking right back at us. "What is it?" Martha whispered again, her voice trembling. The thing was massive. Even from that distance, I could tell it stood at least 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its entire body was covered in thick white fur, long and shaggy in places, not like a polar bear's fur. Wilder, unkempt. It had broad shoulders, a powerful chest, and arms that hung down past where its knees would be. But it was the face that haunts me to this day. Not quite human, not quite animal. A flat nose, deep-set eyes that reflected the moonlight like two black pools, and a heavy brow ridge. Its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, with barely any neck visible. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, we stared at each other, the creature and us. It made no move to come closer. It just watched. Curious, maybe, or territorial. I couldn't tell. "Martha," I said, my voice shaking now. Please drive. Now. This time she listened. She stepped on the gas so hard the tires spun on the asphalt before catching, and we lurched forward. I twisted in my seat to look back, and the thing was still there, still watching us. It hadn't moved an inch. Did you see that? Martha kept saying over and over. Did you see that thing? What was it? What the hell was it? I don't know, was all I could manage. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We were going way too fast for that road. The speedometer needle was pushing past 70, and Highway 37 wasn't made for that kind of speed, especially at night. The curves kept coming, and Martha was taking them recklessly, still looking in the rearview mirror more than at the road ahead. Slow down, I finally managed to say. You're going to get us killed. I'm not stopping, she said. Not until we're far away from that thing. I'm not saying stop, just slow down before you wrap us around a tree. She eased off the gas a little, but we were still going too fast. That's when we rounded a bend and saw the flashing lights ahead. A police car parked on the shoulder with its lights on. Maybe it was a speed trap, or maybe they were helping a stranded motorist. I never found out because Martha didn't even slow down. She flew past that police car doing at least 60. Martha, that was a cop. I don't care, she said, her knuckles still white on the wheel. I'm not stopping, not out here. I looked back and sure enough, the police car pulled onto the road, lights flashing. But Martha just kept driving, not quite as fast, but she wasn't pulling over. You have to stop, I told her. You'll just make it worse. Jessica, I am not stopping on this road, not after what we just saw. They can follow us all the way home if they want to. To my surprise, after following us for about 2 miles, the police car turned its lights off and fell back. Maybe they had more important things to deal with, or maybe they just wrote down Martha's license plate and decided to follow up later. Either way, we were alone on the road again. The rest of the drive home was a blur of anxiety and disbelief. We talked non-stop, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. It was a bear, I suggested at one point, knowing full well it wasn't. Bears don't stand that tall on 2 legs, Martha countered, and they're not white, not around here. Maybe it was someone in a costume. Even as I said it, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. Who would be standing on a remote hillside at night in a costume? You know what it looked like, Martha said quietly. It looked like a Bigfoot, a white Bigfoot. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot before. Who hasn't? But they were always described as brown or black. I'd never heard of a white one. And yet, what else could it have been? It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It moved like something between human and animal. When we finally got home, Frank was already asleep. I woke him up, still shaking, and told him what happened. He listened, then laughed. You ladies have been watching too many late-night monster movies, he said, rolling over to go back to sleep. The next day, Martha called to say Tom had reacted the same way. No one believed us. We told our friends, our other family members, even a few co-workers. Most laughed. Some looked concerned, like they thought we were losing our minds. A few suggested we'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe a very tall man in a light-colored coat. Only Diane seemed to take us seriously. When we drove back out to her place the following weekend, in daylight this time, she told us that other people in 3 Lakes had reported strange sightings over the years. Nothing specific about a white creature, but odd sounds in the night, livestock getting spooked for no reason, and a general sense that something wasn't quite right in those woods. We considered reporting it to someone official, the police or maybe a forest ranger, but after the way everyone else had reacted, we decided against it. What would we say anyway? That we saw a white Bigfoot looking down at us from a hill. They'd think we were crazy or drunk or both. In the weeks that followed, I found myself unable to sleep properly. Every night I'd jolt awake, convinced I could see those deep-set eyes staring at me through my bedroom window. I started keeping the curtains closed at night, something I'd never done before. Martha and I went back once, about a month later. We drove out to the same stretch of Highway 37 in the middle of the afternoon. We tried to find the exact spot where we'd seen the creature, but in daylight, all those hills and curves looked the same. We pulled over at what we thought was the right place and hiked up the hillside a bit, looking for, well, I don't know what. Footprints? Fur? Some sign that what we'd seen was real. We didn't find anything conclusive, just some broken branches that could have been caused by anything, and a strange, musky smell in one particular clearing that neither of us could identify. Not animal, not human, just different. As time passed, we talked about it less and less with others. What was the point? No one believed us anyway, but Martha and I never stopped discussing it between ourselves, never stopped wondering. That was 53 years ago now. Martha passed last spring, still insisting till the end that what we saw that night was real. I'm 75 now, and I know people will just write this off as the ramblings of an old woman. But I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a bear, or a man in a costume, or any other rational explanation people have tried to offer over the years. I've read about other Bigfoot sightings since then. Looked into whether anyone else has ever reported seeing a white one. There are a few accounts scattered here and there, mostly dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. But I know better. Whatever was standing on that hillside in Baraga County that September night was real. It was watching us, and sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night with the unshakable feeling that somewhere out in those Michigan woods, it's still there, still watching, still waiting. Story 2. I've never been the type to believe in monsters. Sure, I'd watch those stupid Bigfoot shows with my husband Mark sometimes, but we'd always laugh at how ridiculous they were. Just people jumping at shadows and mistaking bears for some mythical creature. That was before March of 2005, before 3 nights that changed everything for our family. We live about 5 miles outside Chehalis, Washington, in a 3-bedroom house that sits at the edge of some seriously dense forest. Our nearest neighbors are about a 1/4 mile in either direction, and we're connected to the highway by a winding gravel road that's a nightmare in winter. We've got about 2 acres of cleared land, with a small barn and chicken coop out back. It's peaceful, or at least it was. It started on a Tuesday night. The kids were in bed. Tommy was 9 then, and Emma was 7. Mark and I were watching TV in the living room, nothing special, just unwinding. It was around 11 when we heard it, this deep, drawn-out roar that seemed to echo across our pasture. At first, I thought it might be a cow from the Hendersons' farm down the road, but it was too wrong, too deep, too sustained. Mark muted the TV, and we just looked at each other. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, there was this loud thump against our garage that shook the whole wall, like something massive had slammed into it. We have a German shepherd named Duke who's usually fearless, chases off coyotes, stands his ground against anything. But when we went to check outside, we found him cowering under the porch, whimpering like a puppy. He refused to come out, even when Mark called him. His eyes were wide, and he was shaking. That scared me more than the sound. Mark grabbed his flashlight and checked around the house, but didn't see anything. The next morning, we found a large branch in our driveway, not just fallen, but like it had been placed there. It was stripped of bark in places, almost like something had peeled it off deliberately. Mark said it must have been the wind, but there hadn't been any strong wind that night. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a bear, though we'd never had bear problems before. But deep down, I knew bears don't roar like that, and they don't terrify trained guard dogs. The second night was worse. We'd both been on edge all day. Mark checked all the locks twice before bed, and we put Duke inside for the night, which we rarely do. We went to bed around 10, but neither of us could sleep. Around midnight, we heard it. Heavy footsteps circling the house. Slow, deliberate steps, like something massive walking with purpose. Our bedroom is on the ground floor, facing the backyard. As we lay there frozen in our bed, I could hear deep breathing right outside our wall, not panting like a dog, but slow, rhythmic breathing from something big. Duke was whining and pacing by our bedroom door, but he wouldn't go near the windows. Then there was this sudden bang against the side of the house that made me scream. It felt like the whole house shook. Our metal siding made this horrible rattling sound. Emma woke up crying, and Mark ran to get her while I checked on Tommy. We all ended up huddled in the living room, away from the windows. That's when we heard it, a deep-chested roar of absolute rage from somewhere near the barn. What terrified me most was when another call answered from further in the tree line. There were two of them. Emma was hysterical, and Tommy was trying to act brave, but I could see how scared he was. Mark got his rifle from the gun safe and kept it beside him as we all slept in the living room, lights on. In the morning, Mark checked outside, but again found nothing conclusive, just some disturbed dirt near the barn and a weird, musky smell that hung in the air. The chickens were agitated, and one of our windows had mud smeared on it about 7 feet up. Mark called the sheriff, but they just said it was probably vandals or teenagers, and they'd send someone by on patrol that evening. No one ever showed up. By the third night, we were all wrecked from lack of sleep and stress. The kids were staying with my sister in town. I wasn't taking any chances. Mark and I sat in the kitchen with the lights low, watching out the windows. Duke refused to leave our sides. The rifle was loaded on the table. Around 11, we heard dragging sounds from behind the barn. Then our chickens started making those alarmed noises they make when a predator is near. Mark and I looked at each other, and I could see he was terrified despite trying to hide it. The screaming started again, that same roaring sound, but closer now, right by the chicken coop. It was followed by the sound of splintering wood. We moved to the back windows, and what I saw will haunt me forever. In the dim moonlight, I could make out this massive dark shape. It was hunched over our chicken coop, and as we watched, it literally grabbed the entire structure and tipped it over like it was nothing. The coop was built from 2x4s and chicken wire, about 8 feet long and 4 feet high. This thing dragged it several feet across the yard, with chickens scattering everywhere. Mark grabbed his rifle and ran to the back door. He stood there with the gun raised, but he didn't fire. Later, he told me he couldn't bring himself to shoot because he wasn't sure what he was shooting at, and he was afraid of making it angrier. The creature moved so fast for something so big. When it heard our door open, it straightened up to its full height. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, and let out another one of those roars. Then it just loped away into the tree line, not running on all fours like a bear, but on 2 legs with this weird fluid gait. We were too scared to go outside, so we locked up and stayed awake all night, jumping at every sound. Duke kept growling at the windows until sunrise. In the morning light, we finally went out to survey the damage. The chicken coop was completely demolished, not just tipped over, but broken apart. The wood was splintered and snapped, not chewed or clawed like you'd see with normal predators. Some of the 2x4s were broken clean through, which takes incredible strength. What made my blood run cold were the footprints in the soft ground near what was left of the coop. They were huge. Mark measured one at 15 inches long. They clearly showed 5 toes and a very human-like shape, just massive. Nothing native to these woods makes tracks like that. 6 of our chickens were missing entirely. We found one hen dead, about 20 yards from the coop. She wasn't eaten or torn apart, just crushed like something had squeezed her too hard. Mark took photos of everything before the rain came that afternoon and washed most of the evidence away. The sheriff finally sent a deputy who looked around for about 10 minutes, suggested it might be vandals on drugs, and left. He didn't even want to look at Mark's photos. The strangest thing is that after that third night, the activity just stopped. No more screaming, no more things being thrown or houses being hit, but the woods behind our house remained unnaturally quiet for weeks afterward. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering, even the coyotes stopped howling. It was like everything was hiding. We've rebuilt the chicken coop, stronger this time, with motion sensor lights all around it. We installed security lights around the whole property that stay on all night now. Duke doesn't go outside after dark anymore. He refuses, actually trembles if we try to make him. We don't push it. Mark and I rarely talk about those 3 nights. The kids know something happened, but we've kept the details vague. Tommy thinks it was a bear, and we let him believe that. Emma still has nightmares sometimes. I know what most people would say if I told them this story. That we imagined it or exaggerated it, or that it was just a bear or cougar, but nothing explains everything we experienced. The vocalizations, the strength it took to demolish that coop and break solid lumber, those footprints, and the sheer size of what we glimpsed. I don't use the word Sasquatch out loud. It sounds ridiculous, like something from a cheesy TV show. But I know what we encountered wasn't human, and it wasn't any normal animal either. It was intelligent enough to come back multiple nights, powerful enough to shake our house and destroy wood fencing, and it left behind nothing but those massive footprints and our terror. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm just putting this out there because keeping it bottled up is driving me crazy. We still live in the same house. We can't afford to move, but I never go out back alone anymore, and I'm always watching the tree line, especially at dusk. Whatever visited us for those 3 nights in March could come back any time, and next time it might decide to do more than just scare us and take a few chickens. Story 3. I've never been the type to believe in the supernatural. Sure, I've watched those crappy Bigfoot shows with my buddies over beers, but I always laughed it off. That changed last summer. I still don't know exactly what happened that night, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. It was July 2022. My wife Megan and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We both needed a break from work, me from my construction job and her from teaching 3rd grade. We picked a spot in Washington near Mount Rainier, one of those dispersed camping areas where you're not in an official campground. No neighbors, no camp host, just us and the wilderness. Getting there was half the adventure. We had to navigate this old logging road that was partially washed out. Our Subaru barely made it through some spots, but I was determined to find somewhere truly secluded. We finally found this perfect little clearing about a 1/4 mile from a stream. The spot was beautiful, tall pines all around, enough flat ground for our tent, and nobody else for miles. The first day was perfect. We hiked, cooked over our little camp stove, and sat by a small fire watching the stars come out. That night was completely uneventful. We slept great, woke up refreshed, and spent the second day exploring more trails and relaxing by the stream. It was exactly the kind of peaceful getaway we'd hoped for. The second night is when everything changed. I remember checking my watch before going to bed. It was just after 11. We were both tired from hiking, so we crashed pretty quickly. I fell asleep almost instantly, listening to the familiar sounds of the forest. The light breeze rustling the trees, small animals moving in the underbrush, and the distant trickle of the stream. I woke up suddenly. Something felt wrong. My first thought was that an animal might be near our campsite, but that wasn't it. The forest was completely silent. Not just quiet, silent. No wind in the trees, no animals. I couldn't even hear the stream anymore, which had been audible from our tent all day and night. I tried to turn over to check my watch, but couldn't move. At first, I thought I was still half asleep, but no. I was wide awake. I just couldn't move a single muscle. Not my arms, not my legs. I couldn't even turn my head to look at Megan sleeping beside me. My eyes were fixed straight ahead at the tent ceiling. That's when panic started to build. I tried to speak, to wake Megan up, but my mouth wouldn't work. My vocal cords felt frozen. All I could do was breathe, and even that felt restricted, like something was pressing down on my chest. Then I felt it, a presence. Something was outside our tent. It wasn't a sound that alerted me. It was more like a pressure change. You know how you can feel when someone enters a room even if you don't see or hear them? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. The air felt heavier, almost electrically charged. After a few seconds, I became aware of slight movements outside. Not footsteps exactly, but a shifting of weight. The ground beneath our tent seemed to compress slightly with each shift, like whatever was out there was incredibly heavy. I strained my eyes to look toward the tent wall without moving my head. Our tent is this cheap REI model, just basic canvas, nothing fancy. The moon was bright that night, and through the tent wall, I started to make out a silhouette. Jesus Christ, it was big. I'm 6'2", and this thing was substantially taller. The silhouette showed its head was above the tent wall, but still below the peak. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, like a linebacker on steroids. The shape looked hunched, with almost no visible neck, just this massive head sitting directly on those wide shoulders. The strangest part? I wasn't afraid, and that terrified me more than anything. It was like someone had injected me with some powerful tranquilizer that numbed my emotions but left me completely alert. I couldn't feel fear, just this clinical awareness of everything happening. It felt unnatural, like my body's normal responses were being chemically suppressed. The figure didn't make much noise, just an occasional shift in stance. At one point, I heard what might have been a sniff, or maybe an exhale. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was more like it was curious, studying us. I don't know how long it stood there. Time seemed to stretch and compress in weird ways. It might have been 5 minutes or 50. I honestly couldn't tell you. What I do remember clearly is the moment it left. There was no sound of retreat, no final movement. The presence just vanished. 1 second, the oppressive weight in the air was there, and the next it was gone. Suddenly, I could move again. The paralysis lifted as abruptly as it had come. I sat up gasping, clutching at my chest like I'd been underwater too long. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the flashlight beside me. I clicked it on and pointed it at the tent wall where the figure had been. Nothing. I listened intently. The unnatural silence continued for another minute or so, then gradually the normal forest sounds returned. First the distant stream, then a light breeze, then eventually the small rustles and chirps of nocturnal creatures. Throughout all of this, Megan didn't stir once. She slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware of what had just happened. I debated waking her but decided against it. What would I even say? Hey, I think Bigfoot was just standing outside our tent and somehow paralyzed me. It sounded crazy even in my own head. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat up with my flashlight, knife in hand, listening to every sound outside our tent. Nothing unusual happened again. Dawn eventually came, and with it, a strange sense of unreality. In the morning light, it was easier to dismiss what had happened as some kind of waking nightmare or sleep paralysis episode. Except I know I wasn't asleep. I was fully conscious the entire time. Oddly enough, we stayed another night. I know that sounds insane, but I had somehow convinced myself that I had experienced some weird medical episode. Plus, packing up camp and navigating that rough road in the dark didn't seem like a great option. The third night passed without incident, and we headed home the next morning as planned. I waited almost a week before telling Megan. When I finally did, she initially thought I'd had a nightmare. When I insisted I'd been awake and aware the whole time, she suggested sleep paralysis. I've looked it up since then, and yeah, some of the symptoms match. The inability to move, the feeling of a presence. But sleep paralysis doesn't explain the complete silence in the forest or how I could see a physical silhouette through the tent wall. The longer I've had to process this experience, the more convinced I am that what happened wasn't a normal wildlife encounter. Whatever was outside our tent that night had some kind of ability. It could affect me physically without touching me. It could silence an entire forest. and it could somehow dampen my emotional responses. I haven't gone public with this story until now. I haven't reported it to any park rangers or Bigfoot research groups. Honestly, I was afraid of the ridicule, and part of me wanted to forget it ever happened. But I can't stop thinking about it, especially at night when I'm trying to sleep. I find myself listening for that unnatural silence, that pressure change in the air. We've gone camping since then, but never back to that spot. I made up some excuse about wanting to try new locations, but the truth is, I never want to go back there again. I don't know what stood outside our tent that night. I don't know why it was interested in us, or how it did what it did to me. All I know is that something was there, something big, something intelligent, and something that defies explanation. I still camp, still hike, still enjoy the outdoors. But now I always sleep with one eye open, listening for that moment when the forest goes completely silent. Because now I know what that silence means. Something is watching. Story 4. I've never told many people about what happened to me that day. Just my wife, my brother, and a couple close hunting buddies who wouldn't think I'm crazy. But it's been weighing on me for over 40 years now, and I figure maybe writing it down might help me process it. It was mid-October 1980. I was 27 years old then, working at the paper mill in Lufkin and living for my weekends outdoors. That Saturday morning was perfect duck hunting weather, overcast, light fog hanging over the water, and just cold enough that you could see your breath. I'd been hunting Lake Cherokee since I was a teenager, and I knew all the good spots where wood ducks and mallards like to gather. I left my house around 4:30 in the morning, drove the 45 minutes to my favorite inlet on the northeast side of the lake. It's funny how I can still remember every detail about that morning. The way the gravel crunched under my tires when I pulled off onto the access road, the smell of the thermos coffee I'd brought, even the exact songs that played on the radio during my drive. I parked my old Ford pickup at the small clearing about a quarter-mile from the water. The spot wasn't on any maps back then, just a place locals knew about. I grabbed my Remington shotgun, my canvas bag with shells and gear, and my small cooler. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, just me and the woods, and that pre-dawn silence where you can almost hear the darkness. The walk to my spot was routine. I'd made it hundreds of times before. The path was narrow, winding through pine trees and undergrowth, occasionally opening up where you could catch glimpses of the lake through the trees. I remember the ground was damp from rain earlier in the week, making my footsteps almost silent on the pine needle floor. I reached my usual blind, just a natural depression in the shoreline with cattails and brush that provided good cover. I waded out about 30 yards into the water, setting up where the inlet curved, giving me a clear shot at ducks coming in from either direction. The water was cold through my waders, probably in the low 50s, but I didn't mind. That's just part of duck hunting. The morning hunt went normal as could be. I bagged 3 wood ducks and a mallard by around 9:30. Nothing unusual happened during the hunt itself. No strange sounds, no weird feelings, just a regular, decent morning on the lake. Around 10, I decided to call it a day. The ducks had stopped flying, and I was getting hungry thinking about the bacon and eggs I'd cook up when I got home. I gathered my gear, secured my shotgun strap across my chest, and started wading back toward shore. My canvas bag with the cleaned ducks in one hand, my small cooler in the other. I was about halfway back, still waist deep in the water, when something changed. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a shift in the air. I can't explain it any better than that, just a sudden awareness that something was different. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. At first, I thought maybe another hunter had wandered into the area, though it was unlikely. This spot was pretty isolated, and most folks who hunted Lake Cherokee had their own territories they stuck to out of unspoken courtesy. I stopped moving and slowly scanned the shoreline. Nothing seemed out of place at first, just the usual tangle of pine trees, cypress knees near the water's edge, fallen logs, and dense undergrowth. But then my eyes landed on what I initially took to be a stump or maybe a deadfall about 200 to 300 feet down the shoreline, partially obscured by some brush. Except it wasn't a stump, because it moved. Just a slight shift at first, like it was adjusting its position. That's when my brain started trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was big, much bigger than a man. It stood upright at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden by a cypress, but clearly visible enough that I could make out its outline. It was covered in thick, dark brown hair, not like a bear's fur, but longer, shaggier. The color was uniform across its body, maybe a bit lighter around what I assumed was its face, though I couldn't make out facial features clearly at that distance. What struck me most were the proportions. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees. The shoulders were massive, probably twice as wide as mine, and I wasn't a small guy back then. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was hard to judge exactly with the distance, and it being partially behind vegetation. The thing stood completely still, facing directly toward me. I froze too, waist deep in that cold lake water, my shotgun secured across my chest, but completely forgotten in that moment. I remember my first coherent thought was, that's not possible, that can't be real. But it was real as the water soaking through my waders or the weight of the canvas bag in my hand. Time seemed to stretch out forever as we just stared at each other. I don't know how long we stood like that. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. When you're in a situation like that, time gets weird. I didn't feel threatened exactly. That's the strangest part. If you'd asked me before if I'd be terrified seeing something like that, I'd have said absolutely. But in the moment, what I felt was more like profound unease, like when you realize you've wandered into a place where you fundamentally don't belong. I felt small and very, very human. The creature made no aggressive moves. It just watched me with what I can only describe as intense curiosity or maybe assessment. Like it was trying to figure out what I was going to do, just as much as I was trying to process what I was seeing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, it slowly turned sideways. The movement was deliberate, almost graceful for something so large. It then began walking parallel to the shoreline, away from me. Its gait was smooth but odd, longer strides than a human would take, with a slight roll to its shoulders. It moved with purpose, not hurrying, but covering ground quickly. I watched it walk along the edge of the lake for about 100 yards. Then, without any hesitation or backward glance, it angled toward the tree line and disappeared into the thicker woods. Only after it was gone did I realize I'd been holding my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my gear. My legs felt like rubber, but somehow I managed to wade the rest of the way to shore. I remember stumbling a bit as I climbed out of the water, my eyes never leaving the spot where the creature had vanished into the trees. Part of me wanted to go look for tracks or evidence. The logical part of my brain was already trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs or some kind of elaborate prank. But a deeper instinct told me to get out of there, not because I felt in danger, but because I had witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see, something that existed in the shadows of our world, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I'd spent my whole life in. I made it back to my truck in record time, my heart pounding the whole way. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it following me, but the woods were empty and silent. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the bed, hands still trembling, and got in. I sat there for a good 10 minutes just trying to calm down enough to drive. On the drive home, I tried to process what I'd seen. I knew about Bigfoot stories, of course. Who doesn't? But I'd always written them off as campfire tales or misidentifications. I was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or believing in monsters. Yet I couldn't deny what I'd seen with my own eyes. The thing that struck me most, thinking back on it, was the intelligence I sensed from the creature. It wasn't just a wild animal. There was something almost deliberate about how it revealed itself to me, how it stood its ground, how it departed, like it was making a decision to let me see it, and then making another decision to leave. I didn't tell my wife when I got home. How could I? Hey honey, guess what I saw while duck hunting today? Bigfoot. She'd have thought I was pulling her leg, or that I'd had a few beers with breakfast. So I kept it to myself, acted normal, cooked up my ducks for dinner that night, and tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. But I couldn't sleep that night or the next. I kept seeing those proportions, that fluid walk, those impossibly long arms. I kept feeling that sensation of being regarded by something other, something that existed outside my understanding of the natural world. I didn't go back to Lake Cherokee for almost 6 months after that. When I finally did return, I brought my brother along. I never told him why I suddenly wanted company on my hunting trips, and he never asked. But I think he noticed how I'd tense up at certain sounds, how I'd scan the tree line more than necessary, how I no longer enjoyed being the first one at the lake before dawn. To this day, I've never felt completely comfortable in those woods again. Not because I'm afraid of being harmed. Whatever I saw had every opportunity to approach me if it wanted to and chose not to. It's more that the encounter fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. What I once saw as familiar territory that I understood and belonged in now feels like borrowed space. I'm just a visitor in places where other, older things make their home. I still hunt and fish. I still love the outdoors, but I no longer seek out the most remote spots, the places where you can go all day without seeing another human being. And I always have this feeling in the back of my mind that I'm being watched when I'm out there. I know how this sounds. I know most people reading this will think I imagined it, or that I saw a bear, or that I'm just making up a tall tale. That's why I've rarely talked about it. But I know what I saw that October morning at Lake Cherokee. I know it was real, and I know that it's still out there moving through the East Texas woods like it has for who knows how long, occasionally crossing paths with people like me who are forever changed by the encounter. Story 5. I've never shared this with anyone outside my family, but what happened that night in October 1999 still gives me chills. I think about it more than I'd like to admit. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night wondering if it's out there, watching. It was mid-October, around 8:30 at night. My daughter Emma and I were driving back from Kilgore. She was 8 years old then, sitting in the passenger seat next to me, playing with her Beanie Babies collection we'd just added to. The drive was nothing unusual. We'd taken that rural road hundreds of times before. It connects to the main highway about 15 minutes from our house, winding through thick pine woods most of the way. The night was especially dark. One of those moonless autumn nights where the darkness seems to swallow everything beyond your headlights. I remember thinking how I needed to get the right headlight adjusted because it seemed dimmer than usual. Emma was chattering away about school and her friends, and I was half listening, half focused on the road. The radio was playing softly. I think it was that Santana song with Rob Thomas that was popular back then. I'd just rounded a bend in the road when I spotted something up ahead near the shoulder. At first, I thought it was a deer about to cross. We get a lot of them out here, especially in the evenings. I instinctively took my foot off the gas and slowed down, warning Emma to hold on, just in case I needed to brake suddenly. "What is it, Mom?" she asked, pressing her face closer to the windshield. "Probably just a deer," I said, but as we got closer, I realized it wasn't a deer at all. Whatever it was appeared to be crouched down at first, like it was examining something on the ground. I slowed down even more, probably doing about 20 miles per hour at this point. I remember the sensation of my hands tightening on the steering wheel, my knuckles going white. And then it stood up. God, I'll never forget this as long as I live. This thing rose up to its full height and turned toward our headlights. It happened so fast, but somehow every detail burned itself into my memory. It was tall, much taller than a man, maybe 7 feet at least. It had this impossibly solid build, with shoulders that seemed way too wide for any human. Its arms were wrong, too long, hanging down past where knees would be. They swung slightly as it turned, not like human arms at all. There was this slight hunch to its back and its head. Its head looked like it was sitting directly on those massive shoulders. There wasn't much of a neck that I could see. The face is what still haunts me. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, round and flat, with features that didn't quite make sense. I couldn't make out eyes in the darkness, but I felt them. I swear, I felt them staring right at me through the windshield. The whole thing was covered in this long black hair, not fur exactly, but hair that hung from its body. When our headlights hit it, the hair had this weird silvery blue shimmer to it. I remember my breath catching in my throat. My foot instinctively moved to the brake, and we slowed almost to a stop. We were maybe 30 feet away from it at this point. It just stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds. Then it took a few steps, not toward us, thank God, but toward the tree line. Its gait was strange, kind of loping, but purposeful. It moved with this eerie combination of grace and awkwardness that I can't really explain. Then it simply disappeared into the woods beside the road. Just gone. I sat there frozen, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they ached. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I felt like I was going to throw up. "Mom? Mom? What was that? Mom? What was that?" Emma kept repeating, tugging on my sleeve. Her voice sounded far away, like I was underwater. "Was that a bear? Mom, was it a bear?" I couldn't answer her. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It wasn't anything I could explain. "I don't know, honey," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it was a really big, I don't know. I remember putting my foot back on the gas pedal and driving way too fast the rest of the way home. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Every shadow in the woods seemed to move. Every tree looked like it might be hiding another one of those things. Emma kept asking questions the whole way home. What was it? Why did it look like that? Did I think it was dangerous? Was it going to follow us home? I gave her non-answers, trying to downplay it, trying not to scare her more than she already was. But kids know when adults are bullshitting them. She knew I was scared out of my mind. When we finally pulled into our driveway, my husband Tom was on the porch. He took one look at me as I stepped out of the car and knew something was wrong. Later, he told me I was as white as a sheet and my hands were visibly shaking. I couldn't even get my key in the front door lock. "Melissa, what happened?" he asked, taking the keys from my trembling hand. Emma piped up before I could answer. "We saw a monster on the road, Dad. It was huge and hairy and it looked at us." Tom glanced at me, obviously expecting me to laugh it off or explain that we'd seen a bear or a large man or literally anything other than what Emma was describing. But I couldn't. I just stood there, unable to speak, fighting back tears. That night, after Emma went to bed, I tried to explain to Tom what we'd seen. He listened without interrupting, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Not really. He suggested it might have been a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe someone playing a prank with a costume. I knew better, but I didn't have the energy to argue. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing turning toward our car, its hair shimmering in the headlights. I kept imagining it following us home, watching our house from the edge of the woods behind our property. At one point, around 3 in the morning, I got up and checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. For weeks afterward, I avoided that road. I'd take the longer route through town, adding 20 minutes to my drive, just so I wouldn't have to pass that spot. Emma seemed to bounce back faster than I did. The resilience of childhood, I guess. She still mentioned the monster occasionally, but without the fear that kept me up at night. I started to think maybe I had imagined it. That maybe the shadows and the late hour had played tricks on my eyes, that maybe Tom was right and it was just a bear or some kind of prank. I almost convinced myself. Then in January, about 3 months after our encounter, my oldest daughter Lily had her own experience. Lily was 17 at the time and had her own car. She was driving home from her friend's house one night, taking that same rural road. When she got home, she burst through the door, clearly upset. "Mum, I just saw the weirdest thing," she said, dropping her keys on the counter. "There was this, I don't know how to describe it, like a monkey man or something, crossing the road." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, monkey man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It was big and covered in dark hair," she said. "It walked on 2 legs but hunched over. It crossed the road right in front of me. I almost hit it. It moved so fast." I pressed her for details. Where exactly had she seen it? What time? How big was it? Her description matched what Emma and I had seen, and she'd spotted it less than half a mile from our encounter. The crucial thing was that I had never told Lily about what happened that night in October. Emma might have mentioned the monster, but she wouldn't have been able to describe it in the detail Lily was now providing. That's when I knew for certain we hadn't imagined it. Something was out there. I've spent countless hours researching since then. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, about strange creatures in the woods of East Texas. Some accounts sound eerily similar to what we saw, but I've never reported it officially. Who would believe us? What would they think? It's been over 20 years now, and I still get goosebumps whenever I drive that stretch of road at night. I still scan the tree line, half expecting to see it again. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of movement in the woods, or hear strange sounds that don't belong to any animal I know. Maybe it's just my imagination. Maybe not. Last summer, our neighbor mentioned that something had been going through his trash at night. Said whatever it was stood upright and was strong enough to carry away an entire trash can. He installed motion sensor lights after that. They've been triggered several times since then, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. He's never caught anything on camera, though. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know if it was the same thing Lily encountered or what our neighbor might be dealing with. All I know is that something was there on that road in October 1999. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night and the house is quiet, I swear I can feel it watching me through the darkness, waiting. I still drive through that area sometimes, though I try to avoid it at night. Every time I pass that spot, I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach, like it's still there, hidden just beyond the trees, watching and waiting. For what? I don't know, and that's what scares me the most. Story 6. I've been bow hunting in the Oregon wilderness for nearly 15 years now. I know these woods like the back of my hand. Every trail, every ridge, every seasonal pattern of the local wildlife. But what happened last November has shaken everything I thought I knew about these forests. It was the second weekend of bow season, and I'd been tracking a promising buck for days. The forecast showed perfect hunting conditions, slight overcast, minimal wind, temperatures in the low 40s. I'd scouted an area where 2 deer trails converged along a recent clear cut about 11 miles from the nearest paved road. Perfect ambush spot. I arrived at my location around 3 in the afternoon to give myself plenty of time to set up. I was meticulous about scent control. I always am. I'd washed my clothes in scent-free detergent, kept them sealed in plastic bags with pine needles, and even made my own cover scent by boiling local pine needles and applying the extract to my boots, clothes, and gear. I know it sounds excessive, but these details matter when you're trying to get within 30 yards of an animal that can smell you from hundreds of yards away. I found a dense patch of blackberry bushes that offered good concealment while giving me clear shooting lanes to both trails. The clear cut stretched about 75 feet ahead of me before the forest picked up again on the other side. I settled in, nocked an arrow, and prepared for what could be a long wait. As the hours passed, I saw a few does with fawns, but no sign of the buck I was after. Twilight was setting in around 6:15. The light was fading fast, and I was considering calling it a day when I heard something behind me. Footsteps, heavy ones, slow and deliberate. My first thought was that it might be a buck in rut, trailing a doe. They can get so focused on the scent of a female that they throw caution to the wind. I slowly reached for my bow, careful not to make any sudden movements. The footsteps continued, getting closer. Whatever it was big. I turned my head gradually, trying to catch a glimpse without giving away my position. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard what sounded like deep, controlled breathing. Not the quick snorts of a deer, but something different. Slower. More measured. I gripped my bow tighter and slowly rotated my body to face the direction of the sound. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I had this overwhelming feeling that I wasn't dealing with a deer or a bear or anything I'd encountered before. The footsteps resumed, circling slightly to my right. Then they stopped again, now about 25 yards away. I could see movement through the trees, something large shifting its weight from one foot to another. When I finally got a clear view, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Standing there at the edge of the clearing was... I still struggle to describe it accurately. It was massive, tall, easily 7.5 feet, maybe more. The shoulders were impossibly broad, probably close to 4 feet wide. It was covered in thick, dark fur that looked black in the fading light, though it could have been a very dark brown. But what struck me most was how it stood, completely upright, on 2 legs, with a posture that wasn't quite human, but definitely wasn't like any animal I've ever seen. Its arms hung down to about mid-thigh, longer than a human's proportionally, and they looked powerful enough to snap a small tree. I remember thinking my mind must be playing tricks on me. The light was poor. Shadows can distort things. All the rational explanations people give when faced with something they can't explain. But I was only 25 yards away. I could see it clearly enough. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably about a minute, we just stared at each other. I didn't move. It didn't move, except for this gentle swaying motion, shifting its weight from one foot to the other. I had an arrow nocked, but I never even thought about drawing. It wasn't fear that stopped me. Well, not just fear. It was something else, something I can't quite explain. A kind of respect, I guess, or maybe recognition that whatever this was, it wasn't something I should be hunting. Its face was partially obscured by the fur, but I could make out eyes that reflected what little light remained. They were set deep under a prominent brow ridge. The eyes weren't aggressive or threatening. They seemed curious, intelligent even. That's what unsettled me the most. This wasn't just an animal reacting on instinct. It was observing me, studying me, maybe even assessing whether I was a threat. After about a minute of this standoff, it made a soft sound, not quite a grunt, more like a deep exhale, and then it simply turned and walked back into the forest. No rushing, no crashing through the underbrush. It moved with surprising grace for something so large, disappearing into the trees as silently as it had appeared. I stayed frozen in place for at least 20 minutes after it left. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I packed up my gear as quietly as possible and got the hell out of there. I didn't run. Running in the woods at dusk is a good way to break an ankle or worse. But I moved quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it back to my truck without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched the entire way. I drove to the nearest town and checked into a motel instead of camping as I'd planned. I barely slept that night, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. The next morning, I debated whether to go back. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, chalk it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination, but I knew what I'd seen. I needed to know if there was any physical evidence. So I returned to the spot around noon, when the sun was high and visibility was good. I searched the area where the creature had stood, looking for tracks, hair, anything that might confirm what I'd seen. But the ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, and even though I spent hours combing the area, I couldn't find a single definitive track, not a broken branch, not a tuft of fur, nothing. After that day, I couldn't bring myself to hunt that area again. I tried a few other spots later in the season, but my heart wasn't in it. I kept seeing those eyes, feeling that presence. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound in the woods. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for months. Who would believe me? I've been around hunters my whole life, and I've heard plenty of tall tales. I didn't want to become one of those guys. But then, about 3 months after the incident, I was at a local diner in town. I overheard 2 older men talking in the booth behind me. One of them was describing how his grandson had seen something big walking on 2 legs near his property line last week. The other man wasn't laughing or dismissing it. He was nodding knowingly. I couldn't help myself. I turned around and asked them about it. At first, they were guarded, sizing me up. But when I shared my experience, something changed. They opened up, told me about other sightings in the county going back decades. Places where hunters wouldn't go, unusual sounds in the night, tracks found after heavy snow. Since then, I've discreetly asked around, and I've been shocked by how many locals have stories. They don't broadcast them. Most keep these experiences to themselves or share them only with people they trust. But there's a kind of quiet understanding among many who spend time in these woods that something unusual is out there. I've researched similar encounters online, read books on the subject, even attended a conference where people shared their experiences. Some of the stories match mine so closely it's eerie. The same description of the creature, the same feeling of being observed rather than threatened, the same inability to find concrete evidence afterward. I'm not saying I encountered Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I'm not putting a label on what I saw. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it has fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness I thought I knew so well. The thing that stays with me most isn't the creature's size or appearance, it's those eyes, the intelligence behind them, the awareness. It wasn't looking at me the way a bear or cougar might, as potential prey or a threat. It was looking at me the way you might look at a stranger who unexpectedly appears on your property, with caution, curiosity, and recognition that you're dealing with another thinking being. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in that area. Some nights I wake up suddenly, convinced I can hear those measured, deliberate footsteps approaching. Other times I dream about those eyes watching me from the forest edge. I don't know what's out there in the Oregon wilderness, but I know what I saw, and I know I'm not the only one who's seen it. Something shares these woods with us, something big, intelligent, and incredibly elusive. Something that most people will never encounter, but that fundamentally changes those who do. Say, Story 7. I've never told this story outside of my immediate family. It happened when I was 13, back in the summer of 2007, during what was supposed to be a fun church youth group camping trip. Even now, 15 years later, I get goosebumps thinking about it. Our youth group from Pine Valley Church organized this hiking trip in the Olympic Mountains. I was so excited because my parents hardly ever let me go camping, especially not somewhere as remote as the mountains. We were a decent-sized group, about 10 kids between 12 and 15 years old, plus 4 adult leaders, including our youth pastor Mike and his wife Sarah. The plan was to hike along the Dos Wallops River Trail and camp overnight at Royal Basin. It was a pretty challenging hike for a bunch of kids, maybe 7 or 8 miles of steady uphill climbing. By the time we reached the campsite near this small alpine lake, everyone was exhausted. My legs felt like jelly, and my shoulders were raw from my backpack straps. It was almost sunset when we finally dropped our gear. The campsite was beautiful, but kind of exposed. This small flat area, surrounded by pine trees on one side and opening up to the lake on the other. The mountains rose up all around us, these massive dark silhouettes against the sky. There was this cool rock overhang near the main camping area, where most of the group decided to set up. I was going through this phase where I wanted to prove how independent I was, so I asked Mike if I could set up my sleeping bag about 30 yards away in this small clearing with an amazing view of the stars. After checking that it was still within shouting distance, he said it was fine. Looking back, I wish I'd stayed with the group. Setting up camp took forever. We collected firewood, filtered water from the lake, and cooked these freeze-dried meals that tasted way better than they should have after hiking all day. Everyone was laughing and joking around the campfire, but by 10 o'clock, we were all ready to crash. I remember saying goodnight and walking over to my sleeping spot with my flashlight. The night was perfectly clear. No moon, but millions of stars overhead, brighter than I'd ever seen them in the city. I could see the jagged outline of the mountains against the starry sky. I felt so small, lying there, staring up at the vastness of space. Despite my exhaustion, I couldn't fall asleep right away. The wilderness sounds kept me alert. The wind in the trees, occasional rustling in the bushes, the soft lapping of the lake water. Normal forest stuff, you know. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly. That disorienting feeling when you're not sure what woke you, or even where you are for a second. My watch said it was around 2:15 in the morning. The campfire had died down to embers, just giving off this faint orange glow in the distance. It took me a minute to figure out what felt wrong. Then I realized the mountain silhouette had changed. I know how crazy that sounds, but the jagged outline I'd been staring at before falling asleep now had this unnaturally smooth section, like someone had erased part of the mountain and replaced it with something rounded. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when the smell hit me. If you've ever driven past roadkill on a hot summer day, then mix that with the rankest, most pungent skunk spray you can imagine, plus something musky and wild. That's close to what it smelled like. It was so strong my eyes started watering. I'd never smelled anything like it before, and I hope I never do again. Then this horrible realization crept over me. That wasn't the mountain I was looking at. Something was standing at the foot of my sleeping bag, something so massive it was blocking out part of the mountain behind it. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I couldn't even breathe. My whole body went ice cold with a kind of terror I'd never felt before. Whatever was standing there, it was easily 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe more. Just a huge black silhouette against the stars. I had this primal certainty that if I moved or made a sound, something terrible would happen. So I did the only thing my terrified 13-year-old brain could think of. I slowly pulled my sleeping bag over my head, trying desperately not to shake or make any sudden movements. Inside my sleeping bag, I could hear my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it too. I was sweating despite the cold night air, and that awful smell seeped through the fabric of my sleeping bag. I kept thinking about how thin the material was, how it offered absolutely no protection. I couldn't even cry. I was too scared to make a sound. I have no idea how long I stayed like that. It felt like hours. I kept waiting to feel something grab me through the sleeping bag, or hear breathing or anything. But there was just silence and that horrible smell. Eventually, I gathered every ounce of courage I had and lowered the sleeping bag just enough to peek out. The silhouette was gone. The mountain outline was back to normal, but the smell lingered, and the air felt different somehow, like there was still a presence nearby, watching. I was trying to convince myself I'd imagined it when I heard commotion from the main camp. Kids' voices, urgent whispers, then someone, I think it was Zach, one of the younger kids, said loudly, I swear I saw it, like a big gorilla or something. Another voice, sounded like Emma, said, "It was huge! It was walking right behind our camp." Then came the adults' voices. Everyone calmed down. That was definitely Mike. "There are no gorillas in Washington state. You were dreaming." Sarah's voice followed. "It was probably just shadows from the trees. Go back to sleep, everyone. We have to hike back tomorrow." The voices quieted down, but I could still hear whispers. I wanted so badly to run over and join them, to tell them what I'd seen, but the idea of getting out of my sleeping bag and crossing that dark space between me and the group was terrifying. What if it was still out there, waiting in the trees? So I just lay there, wide awake, every muscle tense, until the sky finally started to lighten around 5 in the morning. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I packed up my stuff faster than I ever had before and practically ran to the main camp. Everyone looked tired, with dark circles under their eyes. No one had gotten much sleep. During breakfast, these sad, soggy granola bars and lukewarm instant cocoa, the younger kids were still talking about what they'd seen. Zach insisted he'd woken up to see a huge, hairy creature walking on 2 legs at the edge of the trees behind our camp. Emma backed him up, saying she saw it too. 2 other kids nodded along, saying they'd caught glimpses of something large moving in the shadows. The adults were having none of it. Mike said it was probably just the older kids trying to scare them, but I knew better. The older kids had been asleep too, and besides, none of us could have stood at the foot of my sleeping bag pretending to be 7 or 8 feet tall, and nobody could fake that smell. When I finally worked up the courage to mention what I'd seen, Mike just patted my shoulder and said, "Your imagination can run wild out here in the wilderness, especially at night. That's why we usually have everyone sleep together." But there was something in his expression that made me think he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. Sarah quickly changed the subject, hurrying us to pack up camp so we could start hiking back. As we were packing, I wandered over to where my sleeping bag had been and looked at the ground. The pine needles were disturbed in a way that didn't match my movements. And at the edge of the clearing, I noticed something else. A small sapling was broken about 6 feet up, snapped clean in half. Not cut, not torn, just broken, as if something large had pushed past it. On the hike back, the adults kept us moving at a brisk pace, much faster than our hike in. No one stopped to take pictures or look at interesting plants like we had on the way up. It was just 7 miles of silent, hurried walking. Even Mike, who usually loved pointing out wildlife and plants, seemed focused only on getting us back to the trailhead as quickly as possible. When we reached the parking lot, there was this collective sense of relief. Parents were already waiting to pick everyone up. As I was loading my gear into my mom's car, I overheard Mike talking to one of the other adult leaders. I only caught fragments. "Forest Service should know," and "not the first report in this area." My mum noticed something was off as soon as I got in the car. When she asked if I had fun, I just nodded, not ready to talk about it. How do you explain to your mum that you saw something impossible? That something that shouldn't exist stood at the foot of your sleeping bag in the middle of the night? I didn't sleep well for weeks afterward. Every night, I'd wake up around 2 in the morning, convinced something was standing in my room, watching me. The smell would come back to me so vividly, I'd have to turn on all the lights to convince myself nothing was there. I've researched it since then, trying to make sense of what happened. I've read about bear encounters, mountain lions, elk. None of them fit what I saw or what the other kids described. None of them would just stand there silently at the foot of a sleeping bag. None of them would walk on 2 legs like what the others saw. The only thing that comes close are the Sasquatch stories from the Olympic Peninsula. I used to think those were just tall tales, the kind of thing tourists buy keychains about. Now I'm not so sure. I've never gone back to Royal Basin. I still go hiking occasionally, but always in groups, always on well-traveled trails, and I never ever sleep away from others. Sometimes I wonder if the other kids still remember it, or if they've convinced themselves it was just their imagination, a shared camp scare. But I know what I saw. Something was there that night, something massive enough to block out part of the mountain, something that smelled like no animal I've ever encountered, something that watched me sleep, and the worst part is, I don't think it was just passing through. I think it was curious. About us. About me. To this day, I can't explain it. But I know it was real, and I know it's still out there, somewhere in those mountains. Story 8. I've been hunting since I was 13, but what happened in November of 2012 is something I still can't explain. I'm writing this because I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw. I'd been planning that bow hunting trip for months. Wayne National Forest in Ohio is beautiful in the fall, and I'd spent weeks scouting for the perfect spot. November is rut season when bucks are on the move looking for does, so your chances of getting a good shot increase dramatically if you know the area well. I'd found a spot where several game trails converged near a small clearing, textbook ambush location. I got to my spot around 5 in the morning while it was still pitch black. The temperature was in the mid-30s, and my breath made little clouds in the beam of my headlamp. I climbed up about 15 feet using my climbing stand, a device that lets you inch your way up a tree trunk. I always felt safer up high, both from detection and from whatever might be wandering around in the dark. By 6:30, I was settled in and ready. The sky was just beginning to lighten, that grey-blue time before sunrise when you can make out shapes but not details. I had my bow ready, my release attached to my wrist, and a thermos of coffee within reach. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be. Around 7, the woods came alive. Birds started their morning calls. Squirrels began rustling through the leaf litter. A few does passed through the clearing about 50 yards away, moving cautiously, stopping to check the wind every few steps. I stayed perfectly still, controlling my breathing like I'd practiced thousands of times before. Then, at around 8:30, something changed. It wasn't a sound that alerted me, it was the absence of sound. The forest went completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Hunters know this silence. It usually means a predator is moving through. I expected to see a coyote, maybe even a black bear, though they're not common in that part of Ohio. The silence stretched on for about 20 minutes. My senses were on high alert, scanning the tree line, watching for movement. That's when I noticed something moving about 70 yards away, between the trees on the far side of the clearing. At first I thought it was a bear. The shape was dark and big, but something was off. It wasn't moving on 4 legs. It was upright, walking. My first thought was another hunter, but no. The shape was all wrong, too bulky, and the movement was different. As it moved between the trees, I caught glimpses of dark brown hair covering its body. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me in the early morning light. But when it stepped into a break in the trees, I saw it clearly. This thing was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. It had a thick body covered in dark brown hair that looked matted in places. Its arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees. The legs were thick and muscular, and its chest and shoulders were incredibly wide. The head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders, without much of a neck. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I've never been so terrified in my life. I'm not a small guy, 6'1", 200 pounds, but I felt tiny looking at this thing. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The creature changed direction and began walking straight toward my tree. Not running, not charging, just a deliberate walk, purposeful, like it knew exactly where it was going. When it got to about 30 yards away, I could see more details. The face wasn't completely covered in hair. There was visible skin around the eyes and nose, darker than human skin. The nose was wide and flat, heavy brows shadowed the eyes, making it hard to see them clearly. The hair on its body looked coarse, almost like a wire brush, and was matted in spots, especially around the shoulders. Its hands were enormous. The fingers were long, longer than human fingers should be, and they looked powerful. I remember thinking how easily those hands could snap branches or bones. I sat frozen in my stand, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. I had my bow, but the thought of shooting at this thing never crossed my mind. Something inside me knew that would be the worst possible decision. Then the creature stopped walking. It was directly beneath my tree now, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably about 20 minutes according to my watch. It paced in a circle around the base of my tree. Occasionally it would let out these deep, chesty growls that sounded like nothing I've ever heard. Not a bear, not a coyote, nothing I could identify. The sound seemed to vibrate through the tree and into my bones. The weird thing was, it never looked directly up at me. Not once. But I knew, I absolutely knew, it was aware of my presence. It was like a cat playing with a mouse, letting me know I was trapped. My legs had gone numb from sitting so still for so long. My throat was bone dry from fear. I kept thinking about my wife and 2 kids at home, wondering if I'd see them again. Would they find my body? Would they even know what happened to me? Then the creature moved to a fallen log about 10 yards from my tree. It squatted down, not like a human would sit, but in this hunched position that still kept it fairly upright. It seemed to be examining something on the ground. I couldn't see what it was looking at, but suddenly, without warning, it slammed its hand down onto the log with such force that I heard the wood crack. The sound echoed through the silent forest like a gunshot. I flinched involuntarily, and my boots scraped against the metal of my stand. It made just the tiniest sound, but in that silence, it might as well have been a siren. The creature's head snapped in my direction, and although I still couldn't see its eyes clearly, I felt its gaze lock onto me. For about 5 seconds, the longest 5 seconds of my life, we stared at each other. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then it stood up to its full height, let out another one of those deep growls, and slowly, almost casually, walked away into the deeper part of the forest. I stayed in that tree for another hour, maybe more. My legs were completely numb. My back was cramping, but there was no way I was coming down until I was absolutely sure that thing was gone. The forest gradually came back to life. First a few bird calls, then the squirrels returned to their business. Nature's all-clear signal. When I finally decided it was safe, my hands were shaking so badly I had trouble unhooking my safety harness. I nearly fell twice coming down the tree. Once on the ground, I grabbed my bow and left everything else, my backpack, my thermos, even my expensive rangefinder. I just wanted out of there. I practically ran the 2 miles back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. When I finally reached the parking area, there were 2 other hunters getting ready to head out. They asked if I'd had any luck, and I just shook my head and got in my truck. What was I supposed to say? On the drive home, I called my buddy Mike, who hunts that area regularly. When I finally worked up the courage to tell him what I'd seen, he got quiet. Then he told me something that sent chills down my spine all over again. Apparently, other hunters had reported strange things in that part of Wayne National Forest for years. Most of the locals avoided the deeper areas altogether, especially during rut season. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked him. "Would you have believed me?" he replied. And honestly, I wouldn't have. I haven't been back to that spot since. I still hunt, but I stick to more open areas now, places where I can see a good distance in all directions. I've told very few people about what happened. Most would think I'm crazy or was seeing things. Maybe I was. God knows I've tried to convince myself of that. But the thing is, I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and sometimes when I'm in the woods and that unnatural silence falls, I find myself scanning the trees, looking for movement, and I always make sure I have a clear path back to my truck. That day changed something fundamental in me. I used to feel at home in the forest. Now I understand that I'm just a visitor there, and not everything in the wild has been discovered or explained. There are things in those woods that don't want to be found, things that have managed to stay hidden despite our cameras and technology and scientific certainty. I don't know what to call what I saw. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, something else entirely. The name doesn't really matter. What matters is that it's out there, and it knows the forest in ways we never will. And sometimes, when it wants to, it lets us know we're not alone. Story 9. I've been hesitant to share this story. Part of me has always feared ridicule. But the other part? Well, the other part of me has never truly recovered from what I witnessed. I'm Charles Parker, a surveyor from Sydney. And what I experienced in 1912 while working in the bush of New South Wales has haunted me for years. Our expedition was routine, mapping unexplored territory about 70 miles inland from Sydney. There were 5 of us, myself, 2 junior surveyors named Thompson and Williams, our guide Burke, who knew the terrain, and Dr. Larson, who was collecting botanical specimens. We'd spent nearly 3 weeks in the field without incident, documenting the landscape and setting markers. That particular day had been grueling. We'd hiked through dense underbrush since dawn, fighting through thickets and climbing steep ridges. By late afternoon, our shoulders ached from carrying equipment, and our water supplies were running dangerously low. Burke suggested we make camp near a small creek he knew of, where we could refill our canteens and rest. The site seemed perfect, a small clearing surrounded by eucalyptus trees, with the promised creek bubbling nearby. We arrived with perhaps 2 hours of daylight remaining. Williams and Thompson set about pitching our canvas tents, while I organized our surveying notes from the day. Burke gathered firewood, and Dr. Larson wandered the perimeter, collecting plant samples as he always did. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing at all. The kookaburras called from the trees, and the air carried that familiar eucalyptus scent that permeates the Australian bush. We were miles from the nearest settlement, but that was normal for our work. The isolation never bothered me before. As darkness fell, we gathered around the campfire Burke had built. The flames cast dancing shadows across our tired faces as we ate our simple dinner of beans, jerky, and hardtack biscuits. Dr. Larson was particularly animated that evening, describing a rare orchid he'd discovered. I remember feeling annoyed at his enthusiasm when all I wanted was sleep. It must have been around 9 o'clock when I first sensed something wasn't right. The night had gone suddenly, unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I glanced at Burke, our guide, and noticed his posture had stiffened. His eyes darted toward the darkness beyond our fire's glow. "You hear that?" he whispered. At first, I heard nothing. Then, barely audible, a soft snapping of twigs. Something was moving methodically through the brush about 20 yards from our camp. Probably just a wallaby, Thompson said, but his voice wavered. Burke shook his head slowly. "Wallabies don't move like that." We all turned toward the sound. The fire had died down somewhat, and our eyes strained to penetrate the darkness. The sounds continued, deliberate, heavy footfalls that no marsupial would make. My mouth went dry. I've spent enough time in the bush to recognize the movements of native wildlife. This was different. The footsteps were too heavy, too purposeful. Then we heard the breathing, deep, ragged breaths that carried clearly through the night air. None of us spoke. We were frozen, 5 men staring wide-eyed into the darkness as something circled our camp. Williams reached for the rifle we kept for protection, but his hands trembled so badly he knocked it over. The clatter seemed deafening in the silence, and immediately the footsteps stopped. For perhaps 30 seconds, nothing happened. The silence was worse than the sounds had been. Then at the edge of our firelight, branches parted. I'll never forget my first glimpse of it. A massive silhouette, unmistakably bipedal but nothing like a human. It stepped forward, just enough for the dying firelight to illuminate its features. It stood between 5'8" and 5'10", though its posture was slightly hunched. but its height didn't convey its massiveness. The creature was covered in thick, coarse hair, a brownish color that seemed to quiver and shift across its enormous body with each breath. The hair wasn't uniform. It grew in patches, thicker across its chest and shoulders, sparser on its stomach. God help me, but its face is what keeps me awake at night, even now. Deeply set eyes, but far larger than a man's, reflected the firelight like twin lanterns. Its nose was flat and wide, almost simian, but the mouth was the worst feature. Even with its jaws closed, I could clearly see two long canine teeth protruding over its lower lip. Williams made a strangled sound beside me. Dr. Larson swayed on his feet, then collapsed in a dead faint. None of us moved to help him. The creature stood there, regarding us with those terrible eyes. It seemed to be assessing us, and I had the distinct impression of intelligence behind that gaze. Not human intelligence, but something ancient and primal. Without warning, it began to thump its chest with its paws. The sound was dull, rhythmic, like distant drums. With each thump, it emitted a growl that started low but grew in volume and intensity. I noticed its arms then, disproportionately long for its body, with forearms that seemed even longer than normal proportion would dictate. Its fingers were elongated too, curling slightly as if designed for grasping tree branches. The growling continued, building to a volume that seemed to vibrate through my chest. I couldn't move. My limbs felt leaden, my mind unable to process what my eyes were seeing. Burke was the first to react. Slowly, he reached for the fire and grabbed a burning branch. The creature tracked his movement, its massive head turning slightly. "Back," Burke said, his voice surprisingly steady as he held the flaming branch toward the creature. "Back away now." The creature's response was immediate and terrifying. It lunged forward 2 steps, bringing it fully into our camp, and let out a roar that seemed to shatter the night. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human, but a horrifying blend of both. I could smell it now. A powerful, musky odor, like wet fur mixed with something rotten. Its stomach hung like a distended sack, reaching halfway down its thighs. The firelight revealed more details of its anatomy, details that have haunted my nightmares. Its leg bones appeared wrong somehow. The fibula seemed much smaller than a human's would be, while the femur was unnaturally long. The proportions were all wrong, like a human form that had been stretched and distorted. Thompson scrambled backward so quickly he upended a pot of water onto the fire. Steam hissed upward as part of our fire dimmed, casting more shadows across the creature's form. "Don't run," Burke whispered urgently. "For God's sake, don't any of you run." The creature continued its chest-thumping display, its growls now interspersed with short, barking sounds. Drool glistened on its protruding teeth. Dr. Larson was still unconscious. Williams had grabbed the rifle but seemed unable to raise it. I stood rooted to the spot, my surveyor's mind absurdly trying to calculate the creature's dimensions, even as terror coursed through me. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, we remained in this frozen tableau. 4 conscious men, 1 unconscious, facing something that shouldn't exist. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature seemed to lose interest. It gave one final, powerful thump to its chest, let out a short roar, and turned away. It ran initially on 2 legs, its gait awkward, but surprisingly fast. After about 15 yards, it dropped forward onto all 4s and vanished into the darkness. The underbrush crashed and swayed in its wake, and then silence descended once more. None of us moved for several minutes. Finally, Burke broke the spell by rushing to rekindle the fire. Williams still clutched the unfired rifle. Thompson was silently weeping. I realized I'd been holding my breath and exhaled shakily. What was that?" Williams finally managed. Burke shook his head, his hands trembling as he fed branches into the revived flames. "I've heard stories, old stories from the Aboriginal people. They call it different names. A hairy man, a wild man of the woods. I never believed." We managed to revive Dr. Larson, who was disoriented and ashamed of his faint. None of us blamed him. If anything, unconsciousness seemed preferable to what we'd witnessed. We kept the fire blazing all night. None of us slept. We sat back to back in a circle, listening to every sound from the darkness. Occasionally, we would hear distant crashes through the underbrush, and once, hours later, a long, mournful howl that made my skin crawl. At first light, we packed our camp in record time. Dr. Larson insisted we should try to find tracks, to document what we'd seen. Burke refused outright. Thompson and Williams backed him. I remained ambivalent. Part of me wanted proof, wanted to confirm that what we'd seen was real and not some mass hallucination. But the greater part of me just wanted to leave that place forever. We abandoned our survey work and headed back to Sydney immediately. The return journey passed in near silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. By unspoken agreement, we decided not to speak of what we'd seen once we returned to civilization. Who would believe us? What would it do to our reputations, our careers? But I know what I saw. I've spent decades trying to reconcile it with my understanding of the natural world. Those eyes, that impossible anatomy, the intelligence behind its gaze. It wasn't just an animal, but it wasn't human either. I've never returned to that part of New South Wales. I confined my survey work to areas closer to settlements after that. The others did likewise. Dr. Larson gave up field research entirely and took a teaching position at the university. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, that hairy man with the 2 long arms and protruding teeth. I wonder if others have encountered it and, like us, chosen to remain silent rather than face ridicule. All I know is that the Australian bush holds secrets that no survey map can capture, and some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those inhuman eyes reflecting our campfire, studying us with an intelligence that had no place in the wilderness. Story 10. I've always considered myself a reasonable guy. I hunt, I fish, I spend more time in the woods than most. I know Vancouver Island's wildlife like the back of my hand. The sounds of cougars at night, the bugle of elk in rut, the way a black bear moves through brush. Until last month, I would have laughed if someone told me they saw a Bigfoot. Now, I don't laugh anymore. This happened just a few weeks ago in the forests above Bowser, that area between Qualicum and Courtney. If you know the island, you know it's pretty remote once you get off the main roads. My buddy Rick and I had driven up his old logging road to collect firewood for the winter. It was a clear day, unusually warm for autumn, not a cloud in the sky. Nothing felt off or strange when we arrived. Rick has this massive bull mastiff named Duke, 150 pounds of muscle that fears absolutely nothing. I've seen this dog chase full-grown black bears up trees and send cougars packing with its tail between its legs. Duke's the kind of dog that makes you feel safe in the backcountry. He's not just brave, he's fearless to the point of stupidity. We pulled up to our usual spot around 2 in the afternoon. The plan was simple. Spend a few hours cutting deadfall, load up the truck, and be home before dark. When we arrived, Rick let Duke out of the truck like always. The dog immediately did his usual thing, bouncing around excitedly, marking territory and disappearing into the brush to explore. Nothing unusual there. We started unloading the gear, chainsaw, axes, some rope, and the other stuff we needed. I remember checking my watch. It was 2:23 because I was thinking we had about 4 hours of good daylight left. Rick was telling me about some problem with his truck's transmission when we heard it. Duke started yelping, not barking, not growling, but this high-pitched sound I'd never heard him make before. It was the sound of pure terror. Before we could even process what was happening, Duke came tearing back through the brush like his life depended on it. This 150-pound beast that feared nothing was running for his life. He bolted straight for the truck, jumped into the cab through the open window, something I didn't even know he could do, and curled into this tight little ball, on the floor of the passenger side. He was trembling violently, whimpering, with his tail tucked so far under him you couldn't see it. I remember looking at Rick and seeing the same confusion on his face that I was feeling. In all the years he'd had Duke, neither of us had ever seen anything like this. Rick called out to him, even offered a treat, but Duke wouldn't budge. He just stared out the window with these wide, terrified eyes, his whole body shaking. I felt this cold feeling wash over me. If something had scared Duke this badly, what the hell was out there? That's when Rick grabbed my arm and pointed to our right. "What the fuck is that?" he whispered. About 70 yards away, moving through the brush, was something. At first, my brain tried to make it a bear, because that would make sense, right? But bears don't stand 8 or 9 feet tall. Bears don't move through dense brush like it's nothing. This thing was massive. I'm 6'2", and it towered over any height I could imagine a person reaching. It was covered in thick, dark brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like a shaggy coat that hung from its body. The brush it was moving through was thick salal and Oregon grape, easily 3 feet deep in spots, the kind of vegetation that would slow even the most experienced hiker to a crawl. But this thing, it moved through it like it wasn't even there, not crashing, not making a path, just gliding through with these long, fluid strides. It was moving fast too, covering ground at a pace that seemed impossible for its size. It never fully turned toward us, but I could see its profile clearly enough. A massive, broad back, long arms that hung down past where a human's would end, and this strange, conical-shaped head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders without much of a neck. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 15 seconds before it disappeared into the thicker forest beyond. Neither of us spoke for what felt like minutes. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Did you see that?" Rick finally whispered, his voice cracking. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We stood there frozen, straining to hear any sound of it moving through the forest, but there was nothing. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just this heavy, pressing silence that felt physical. Duke was still trembling in the truck, occasionally letting out these low whimpers. I remember thinking how wrong this all felt. This was a dog that would stand his ground against any predator, a dog that had never shown fear of anything in his life, and now he was reduced to a quivering mess. "We should go," Rick said finally, his voice still barely above a whisper. I nodded again, but neither of us moved right away. There was this unspoken fear that if we turned our backs, if we made noise packing up, it might come back, but standing there doing nothing wasn't an option either. Moving as quietly as we could, we packed up our gear. No chainsaw work that day. We kept scanning the tree line, jumping at every sound. That's when I realized something that makes my skin crawl even now. The thing had made no sound, none. Something that size moving through dense brush should have sounded like a bulldozer, but it had been completely silent. As we were loading the last of our gear, I heard a sound from deeper in the forest that made the hair on my neck stand up. I've spent my life in these woods. I know what a cougar sounds like when it screams. I know elk and deer vocalizations. I know the calls of every owl species on the island. This wasn't any of those. It was a long, powerful scream that started low and rose to a pitch that seemed impossible. It echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate in my chest. Rick and I froze again, our eyes locked on each other's. Duke started that whimpering again, pushing himself further under the dashboard. "We need to leave. Now." Rick's voice was steady but tight with fear. We practically threw the last of our gear in the back and jumped in the cab. Duke was still on the floor, refusing to get up on the seat. Rick turned the key and the engine roared to life. I've never been so happy to hear that sound in my life. As we pulled away, bumping down that old logging road faster than was safe, I kept watching the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing emerge from the trees behind us. It never did, but that didn't stop my heart from racing all the way back to the main road. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything that was supposed to exist in these forests. Duke gradually calmed down as we got further away, eventually climbing up onto the seat, though he stayed pressed against Rick's side the whole time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure moving through the brush with impossible speed and grace. I kept hearing that scream echoing through the trees. I've heard strange sounds in those woods before. Everyone who spends time up there has, but I always wrote them off as known animals, the wind, or my imagination. Now I'm not so sure. I did some research afterward. Turns out Bowser's not far from Strathcona National Park, which has a long history of Bigfoot sightings. People have been reporting encounters in those mountains for decades. I used to think they were all just stories, misidentifications, or outright lies. Now I'm one of those people with a story that sounds insane to anyone who wasn't there. It's been 3 weeks, and Rick and I have barely talked about it. When we do, it's in these careful, measured terms, like we're afraid to fully acknowledge what we saw. Duke hasn't been the same either. He used to love going into the woods. Now he refuses to get out of the truck if Rick drives up any logging road. He'll just sit there, staring out the window with those same frightened eyes. I've always been the skeptical type. I need evidence, proof, but I know what I saw that day above Bowser. I know what made a 150-pound fearless dog curl up like a terrified puppy. I know that nothing in the recognized animal kingdom moves like that thing moved or makes the sound we heard. The strangest part is how it's changed the way I see the forest now. These woods have been my second home my entire life. I've never feared them, even at night, even alone. Now there's this constant awareness that something else is out there, something that can move without sound, something that even the most fearless predators are terrified of. I haven't been back to that spot since. I'm not sure I ever will. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, but sometimes at night, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear that scream again, carried on the air from the mountains. And Duke, who used to sleep like a rock, will lift his head and stare toward the window with those same frightened eyes. I don't know what's out there in the forests above Bowser, but whatever it is, it's watching, waiting, and it's been there a lot longer than us. Story 11. I've never been one for telling wild stories. Anyone who knows me will tell you I'm about as straightforward as they come. I've been living on China Beach for 4 summers now, and I've seen my share of wildlife, bears, cougars, even a wolf once. But what happened to me in early June of 1994 is something entirely different, something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I live pretty simply out here. Got a small cabin tucked away near the tree line, just far enough from the tourists who come during peak season. I like my solitude, the rhythm of the waves, and the freedom to live on my own terms. The locals know me as the beach hermit, which I don't mind. Better than some nicknames I've had over the years. That morning started like any other. I woke up around 5:30, made coffee on my little propane stove, and took my mug down to sit on my driftwood log to watch the sunrise. The beach was completely empty. Too early for visitors and still a bit too cold for the summer crowd. The tide was out, exposing a wide stretch of wet sand dotted with tide pools. It was one of those perfect Pacific Northwest mornings, misty, but with the promise of sunshine later. After finishing my coffee, I decided to collect some firewood from the edge of the forest. The winter storms had brought down plenty of branches, and I wanted to stock up before the afternoon. I grabbed my hatchet and a length of rope to bundle whatever I found. I'd been at it maybe 20 minutes, working my way along the forest edge about 50 yards from my cabin, when I heard something moving in the trees. Not unusual. Probably a deer, I thought. I kept working, gathering smaller branches and breaking them to size. Then I felt it. That sensation when you're being watched. Every hair on my arm stood up. It wasn't the casual curiosity of a deer, or even the predatory gaze of a cougar. This felt intelligent, focused. I straightened up slowly and scanned the forest edge. Nothing at first, just the usual wall of green, cedars, spruce and underbrush. The morning mist was still hanging in patches among the trees, making it hard to distinguish shapes clearly. That's when I saw movement about 30 yards down the beach, where the forest comes closest to the shoreline. Something was emerging from the trees. At first I thought it might be a bear. We get black bears around here fairly often. But as it moved fully onto the beach, I realized this was no bear. The thing was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It walked upright on 2 legs with a smooth, rolling gait that was undeniably human-like, but also not. Its body was covered in dark, almost black hair, thick and matted in places. The contrast against the light sand was startling, like someone had cut a moving shadow out of the forest and placed it on the beach. I froze completely. My hatchet hung limply in my hand as I watched this creature move along the edge of the beach. It wasn't running or even walking quickly. It moved with purpose, like it had somewhere to be, scanning the shoreline as it went. Its arms were long, too long, swinging slightly with each stride. I remember thinking how bizarre it was to see something so out of place in broad daylight. This wasn't some shadowy glimpse at dusk or a shape in the distance. This was right there, maybe 40 yards away at its closest point, walking on my beach. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I'd never believed in Sasquatch or Bigfoot, or whatever you want to call it. Sure, I'd heard the stories, everyone around here has, but I'd always written them off as campfire tales or misidentified bears. But what was in front of me wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a suit, it was something else entirely. I must have shifted my weight or made some small noise because suddenly it stopped. Its whole body tensed and it turned its head toward me. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I could feel its gaze lock onto me. Time seemed to stretch out in that moment. Neither of us moved. I wasn't even sure I was breathing. Then it turned, not just its head, but its entire body, to face me directly. That's when I got my best look at it. The body was massive, with a barrel chest and powerful shoulders. No neck to speak of. Its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, and its face, God, its face. It was flat and wide, with a pronounced brow ridge. I couldn't make out details at that distance, but the eyes caught what little sunlight was breaking through the mist. They reflected back with an amber glow. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I felt rooted to the spot, like my boots had sunk into the sand. I wasn't exactly afraid, more like completely overwhelmed, like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then it made a sound, a sort of huffing exhale that carried across the beach. Not a growl or a call, just a breath, but deeper and louder than anything human could produce. That sound snapped me back to reality. I gripped my hatchet tighter, not as a weapon. What good would it do against something that size? But as something solid to hold onto. The creature took a step backward, still facing me, then another. Its movements were deliberate, cautious, not panicked, but clearly it wanted distance between us. As it reached the tree line, it turned with surprising agility and moved into the forest. The vegetation seemed to swallow it whole. One moment it was there, a massive dark figure against the green, and the next it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. My legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down right there on the damp sand. The wood I'd collected lay scattered around me, forgotten. The rational part of my brain immediately started trying to explain away what I'd just seen. A bear walking upright? Some kind of elaborate prank? But I knew better. I've lived in these woods most of my life. I know what bears look like, how they move. This was something else entirely. After I calmed down enough to stand, I walked over to where the creature had been. The sand was wet enough from the morning dew to hold impressions, and there they were. Footprints, not bear tracks, not human tracks. These were huge, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were pressed deep into the sand, suggesting something of considerable weight. I followed them to the forest edge, where they disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't have a camera. Who carries a camera to collect firewood? I thought about running back to my cabin to grab mine, but I knew the tide would come in soon and wash away the prints. Besides, would a photo of some ambiguous footprints in the sand prove anything? Who would believe me? The rest of that day was a blur. I remember going back to my cabin and sitting there with the door locked, something I never do. I made myself tea with shaking hands and tried to process what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would I tell? The tourists with their beach umbrellas and coolers full of beer. The park rangers who already thought I was a bit odd for living out here year-round. It wasn't until about a month later that I mentioned it to anyone. A British tourist had wandered far down the beach, away from the more popular spots, and ended up near my cabin. Friendly fellow, curious about my setup out here. We got to talking and somehow it just came out. I told him exactly what I'd seen, with no embellishment. I didn't need to exaggerate. The truth was strange enough. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. Didn't call me crazy or laugh it off. When I finished, he just nodded and said, "You know, there are similar stories where I'm from. Different names, but the same idea. Something living in the wild places that we can't quite explain." That conversation helped me more than I expected. Not because he believed me necessarily, but because he didn't immediately dismiss me. It made me feel less alone with this thing that had happened. It's been about 2 months now since that morning. I still live in my cabin on China Beach, still collect driftwood and watch the sunrise, but I'm more aware of the forest edge now, more attuned to sounds in the underbrush. I find myself scanning the tree line when I'm alone on the beach, wondering if it's watching me. I haven't seen it again. Part of me hopes I never do. But another part, a part I don't fully understand, hopes for one more glimpse, one more moment of connection with something that shouldn't exist, but clearly does. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I'm not sure I would if someone told it to me. But it happened exactly as I've described it. On a clear June morning on an empty stretch of China Beach, I saw something that has changed how I see the world. These forests, these wild places, they still hold secrets. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very unlucky, those secrets show themselves in broad daylight. I still don't know what to call what I saw. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. Those names seem almost silly for something so real, so present. All I know is that it was there, and I was there, and for a brief moment we acknowledged each other's existence. Then it returned to its world, and I to mine, with just a stretch of sand between us. Story 12. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. Even now, as I'm typing this out, my hands are shaking. What happened to me wasn't just once, but twice in my life, and I still struggle to explain it. The first incident happened when I was 6 years old. My family had a lake house in northern Indiana, just a few miles from the Michigan state line. It was one of those places where you could hear the water lapping at the shore at night, where summers felt endless and magical. At least they did until that evening. My little sister Nikki was 4 at the time. We were having one of our usual checkers matches on our parents' bed. The bedroom had this big window that faced the backyard and the lake beyond. It was summer, just before sunset, still light enough outside that we didn't need to turn on any lamps yet. I remember I was winning. I always let Nikki capture a few of my pieces to keep her interested. When this feeling washed over me, it's hard to describe, but it was like someone had suddenly cranked the volume down on the world. The birds outside stopped chirping. The sound of my mom making dinner in the kitchen seemed to fade away. And then came this overwhelming sense of dread that made my skin prickle. I didn't want to look up from the checkerboard. I just knew something was watching us, but I couldn't help myself. When I raised my eyes to the window, what I saw still haunts my nightmares. Two enormous red eyes were staring directly at us, not reddish-brown, like a deer's eyes might appear in certain light. Red, like two glowing coals, but alive and intelligent. They were huge, maybe the size of tennis balls, set wide apart in what I could only make out as a dark shape outside the window. The thing that makes me shudder even now is how those eyes moved. They were first fixed on Nikki, who was obliviously contemplating her next move in our game. Then, as if sensing my awareness, they shifted to me, our gazes locked, and in that moment I felt a low, rumbling growl. I didn't just hear it, I felt it, like bass vibrating through my chest. "Nikki," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the window. "There's a monster looking at us." She looked up at me first, thinking I was joking. Then she followed my gaze to the window. Both of us screamed at the same time and scrambled off the bed. We ran like our lives depended on it, through the hallway and into the kitchen where my mom was cooking dinner. We were hysterical, both talking over each other, tugging at her apron. Mom, there's a monster outside our window." My mom tried to calm us down, saying it was probably just a raccoon that had climbed up onto the deck, or maybe a reflection from a boat on the lake. Dad went outside to check, but found nothing. They both dismissed it, but they did let us sleep in their room that night. For years afterward, I tried to convince myself they were right. It was just a raccoon, or my imagination, or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. When I was about 19, I went back to that lake house. It had been years since that incident, but I'd never forgotten those eyes. Standing outside, I looked up at that window and felt a chill run through me. That window was high, much higher than I remembered. I actually measured it. The bottom of the window was about 8 feet off the ground, and the eyes had been looking directly in, maybe even a foot higher than that. What raccoon stands 9 feet tall? I pushed the memory away as best I could and went on with my life. I moved to a different part of Indiana, got my own place near some beautiful woodlands. I took up bow hunting in my 20s, finding peace in the quiet solitude of the forest. Being alone in nature never scared me until my second encounter. It was early November, bow season in full swing. I'd been hunting this same area for 3 years and knew every trail, every tree stand. That morning, I'd gone out before dawn, settling into my spot as the first light broke through the trees. After a few uneventful hours, I decided to move to a different location about a half-mile away. The woods were quiet that day, too quiet. No squirrels chattering, no birds calling, just the sound of dry leaves crunching under my boots as I walked the narrow trail. I'd gone maybe a quarter mile when that familiar feeling returned. That same skin-prickling dread I'd felt as a child. Something was watching me, following me. At first, I tried to dismiss it. I'm an experienced hunter. I know the woods and their sounds. But then I heard it. Footsteps, not quite in sync with mine, but moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. Something was paralleling my path through the trees to my right. My heart started racing. I picked up my pace slightly, and whatever it was matched me. I slowed down, and it slowed too. This wasn't an animal reacting to my presence. This was something deliberately tracking me, mimicking my movements. I clutched my bow tighter, though it suddenly felt useless in my hands. After walking another 100 yards with this unseen companion, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to look. I stopped and slowly turned my head toward the sound. Through the trees, about 35 yards away, stood a dark silhouette. Even at that distance, I could tell it was massive, far taller than any man. It was just standing there, partially hidden behind a large oak, but there was no mistaking its shape. It was vaguely human-like, but wrong, all wrong. The proportions were off, the shoulders too wide, the arms too long. and though I couldn't make out its face clearly through the trees and shadows, I had the horrible certainty that if I could, I'd see those same red eyes from my childhood. Pure terror washed over me. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. My throat closed up. But somehow, from some deeply buried memory or instinct, words came to me. My grandmother had been a deeply religious woman who believed in old protections against evil things in the woods. Words she'd taught me as a child bubbled up from some forgotten place. In a voice that didn't even sound like my own, I shouted, "Guardian of the woods, descendant of Esau and Cain, leave this place in the name of Jesus Christ and do not come back." There was a moment of absolute stillness. Then a grunt, a deep rumbling sound that I felt more than heard, just like that growl from my childhood. It vibrated through the ground, through my chest, making my teeth chatter. The shape moved, not gradually, not with the cautious retreat of a bear or deer. It took a single, impossible step backward and was swallowed by the deeper woods. One moment it was there, the next gone. But the sound of breaking branches and disturbed undergrowth continued for several seconds as it moved away with alarming speed. I didn't wait around. I turned and ran all the way back to my truck, never looking back, my bow clutched uselessly in my shaking hands. I haven't been hunting since. It's been 5 years, and I still don't know what I saw that day, or what watched my sister and me through that window when I was 6. I've researched local legends, read about Bigfoot sightings in the area, even delved into some darker folklore about forest spirits and demons. Nothing quite matches what I experienced. The logical part of my brain tries to find explanations. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs that day in the woods. Maybe those red eyes were just reflections, but deep down, I know better. Whatever watched me through that window, whatever followed me through those woods, it was aware, it was intelligent, and somehow, it knew me. I've moved to the city now. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I find myself staring out my apartment window, half expecting to see those red eyes staring back at me. And I wonder, if it found me once after all those years, could it find me again? The words I shouted that day seemed to work, but what if they only worked temporarily? What if it's still out there, waiting, watching? What if next time words won't be enough? Story 13. I still get chills thinking about that August evening in 2016. It's been almost 7 years, but the memory is seared into my brain like it happened yesterday. I was 11 then, almost 12, one of the older kids in our little neighborhood crew near Fall City. It was one of those perfect late summer days in Western Oregon. Not too hot, sky clear and blue, the kind of day where parents just tell you to be home by dark. There were 6 of us playing in the Miller's Field that evening. Me, my little brother Ethan, who was 7, the Jensen twins, Kate and Kyle, who were both 9, little Zoe, who was only 5, and Derek, who was 12 and technically in charge, though none of us really listened to him. The Millers didn't mind us using their field as long as we didn't mess with their fence or leave trash behind. We'd spent most of the day building this elaborate fort out of fallen branches and playing this made-up game that was half capture the flag, half zombie apocalypse. You know how kids are. By evening, we were getting tired, but nobody wanted to go home yet. The sun was starting to set, casting this golden light across the field that made everything look magical. The shadows from the forest that bordered the west side of the field were getting longer. I remember Zoe was picking wildflowers near the edge of our fort, making some kind of crown or something. Ethan and Kyle were arguing about who would be it for the next round. Derek was checking his phone, probably texting his mom to say we'd be heading back soon. Kate was helping Zoe with her flowers. That's when I heard Zoe make this weird sound. Not quite a gasp, not quite a squeak. I looked over, and she was just frozen, staring toward the tree line. I followed her gaze, thinking maybe she'd spotted a deer or something cool. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a bear standing up. But bears don't stand that tall. and bears don't move like that. It was stepping over the barbed wire fence that separated the field from the forest. Just stepping over it, like it was nothing. The fence was at least 4 feet high, and this thing just lifted its leg and stepped right over without even bending down. "Guys," I whispered, not taking my eyes off it. "Look." One by one, the others turned to look. Nobody said a word. We just stood there, completely frozen. It was huge, impossibly huge. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. It was covered in this thick, dark brown hair. Not uniform, though, patchy in some places, longer around its arms. The hair wasn't black like you see in those cheesy Bigfoot documentaries. It was definitely brown, with some reddish tints where the sun hit it. Its face, God, its face is what still shows up in my nightmares sometimes. It had less hair there, so you could see this dark, leathery-looking skin. Its eyes were deep set, shadowed by a prominent brow ridge. I couldn't tell you what color they were. We were too far away for that. But they looked intelligent. That's the only word I can think of. Like there was something thinking behind them. The weirdest thing was its head. It looked too big for its body, but not in a cartoonish way. More like extremely muscular and powerful. And it didn't really have a neck. The head just kind of sat directly on these massive shoulders. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in these huge hands. I remember thinking they looked almost human-like, but way bigger. Its legs were thick and powerful looking, like tree trunks, and its feet were wide and flat. It just stood there, watching us. Not making any noise, not charging at us, just watching, like it was curious. I don't know how long we all stood there staring at each other, probably only seconds, but it felt like forever. Then Zoe started crying. That broke the spell. Derek was the first to move. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Zoe's hand. We all turned and bolted toward the Miller house, which was about a quarter-mile across the field. I remember hearing everyone's panicked breathing, the thud of our feet on the dry summer grass. I glanced back once, and the thing was still just standing there, watching us run. Ethan tripped and fell hard. I skidded to a stop and ran back to him. His knee was bleeding and he was starting to cry. "Come on," I yelled, yanking him up. "We have to go." I looked back again. The creature had taken a few steps into the field now. It wasn't running after us, just walking. Slowly, deliberately. That was almost scarier than if it had charged. I half-dragged, half-carried Ethan as we ran toward the others. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My mouth was dry. I kept thinking, this isn't real. This can't be real. But it was. We reached the others just as they got to the Miller house. Mrs. Miller was on the back porch, probably wondering what all the commotion was about. Derek was already shouting something to her, but he was so out of breath and panicked it didn't make sense. There's something in the field. Kate finally managed to get out. Mrs. Miller looked concerned, but not alarmed. "What do you mean, something?" "A monster," Zoe wailed, still crying. "It was huge," Kyle added, his voice shaking, "like really huge." Mrs. Miller frowned and looked out toward the field. By then, Mr. Miller had come outside too. "Show me," he said, already stepping off the porch. He grabbed a flashlight even though it wasn't fully dark yet. We all followed him, staying close together, none of us wanting to go back toward that field, but also not wanting to be left behind. Ethan clutched my hand so hard it hurt. When we reached the edge of the field, there was nothing there. The creature was gone. The sun had sunk lower and shadows stretched across most of the field now. "It was right there," Derek insisted, pointing toward the fence line, "by those pine trees." Mr. Miller walked out a little way into the field, scanning with his flashlight, then came back looking puzzled. "Well, whatever it was, it's gone now," he said. "Probably just a bear or an elk. They wander through sometimes." "It wasn't a bear," I said quietly. "It was standing up on 2 legs the whole time." Mr. Miller gave me a strange look. Mrs. Miller put her arm around Zoe, who was still sniffling. "I think you kids just scared yourselves. Mrs. Miller said gently. It's getting dark, and sometimes shadows play tricks on you. None of us argued, but we all knew what we'd seen. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It wasn't a bear or an elk. It was something else entirely. Mr. Miller called our parents to come pick us up. Nobody wanted to walk home, not even Derek, who lived right next door to the Millers. While we waited, we sat huddled on the Millers' porch, jumping at every little sound from the forest. My mum arrived first, looking worried. She took one look at Ethan's bloody knee and my pale face and demanded to know what happened. "There was a monster in the field, Mum," Ethan blurted out before I could say anything. Mum looked at the Millers, who just shrugged. "They saw something that scared them," Mrs. Miller explained. "Probably just wildlife." "It was a Sasquatch," I said firmly, using the word for the first time. Up until then, I'd never really believed in Bigfoot or any of that stuff, but I knew what I'd seen. Mum gave me that look parents give when they think you're making things up. "Honey, there's no such thing." "We all saw it," Kate chimed in. "It was huge and hairy and walked like a person." One by one, all the parents arrived and got versions of the same story from their kids. Some seemed concerned, others amused. None of them believed us. The next morning, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. "Bill Miller called," my dad was saying. "He went out to check the field this morning. Said there were broken branches along the fence line and a wide path through the grass where something heavy had walked. Could have been anything," Mom replied, but she sounded uncertain. He also said the barbed wire on the fence was bent, like something had stepped over it. Something heavy. They got quiet when they noticed me standing in the doorway. I didn't tell them that I'd barely slept that night, that every time I closed my eyes I saw that creature's face, those intelligent eyes watching us. I didn't tell them that I kept imagining it coming to our house, looking in my window. For weeks afterward, none of us would go near that field, especially in the evenings. Ethan had nightmares almost every night. He'd wake up screaming that the forest man was watching him. I pretended I was fine, but I wasn't. I started keeping my blinds closed at all times. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. About a week after it happened, Kyle claimed he saw it again, standing at the edge of the forest behind his house. Nobody believed him except us kids. We believed him because we knew the truth. The weirdest part was that the creature never acted aggressive. It didn't roar or beat its chest or chase us. It just stood there watching, then walked away when we ran. That was almost scarier somehow. The deliberateness of it, the calm curiosity. Like it was studying us. We never officially reported it. Who would we even tell? The local sheriff. He'd just laugh it off. But the story spread among neighbors anyway. People started being more careful about letting their kids play near the woods, especially as it got dark. Some neighbors even claimed they'd heard strange sounds at night. Not quite human, not quite animal. 7 years later, we've all grown up and mostly moved on. Derek's in college now. The Jensen twins moved away when their dad got a new job. Zoe's family still lives there. My family does too, though I'm away at college most of the time. Ethan's in high school now. But whenever I go home and drive past that field, I still get goosebumps. I still scan the tree line, half expecting to see that massive shape watching me. Sometimes when I'm home alone at night, I think I hear heavy footsteps outside my window. Most people think we just saw a bear or made the whole thing up, but the 6 of us know what we saw that day. We don't talk about it much anymore, but when we do, our stories haven't changed. The details are still the same. The height, the hair, the eyes, the way it moved. I don't know if what we saw was actually a Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I just know it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever seen before or since. And I know that somewhere out in those woods it might still be there, watching and waiting. For what? I don't know. And that's what scares me the most. Story I've been hunting for over 15 years now. And I've never shared this with anyone outside my immediate family. Honestly, I'm not even sure why I'm writing this now. except that it's been 3 years, and I still can't make sense of what happened that night in Sam Houston National Forest. First, some background. I'm not some weekend warrior who goes out once a year during deer season. I practically grew up in the woods. My dad had me tracking game before I could do multiplication tables. I've hunted everything from whitetail to wild hog across 3 states. And I spend at least 2 weekends a month in the field during season. I know what animals sound like, how they move, and how they react to human presence. I'm telling you this because what I'm about to describe doesn't fit anything in my experience. It was late November, unseasonably warm for Texas that year. I'd been having good luck calling bobcats in that area of Sam Houston, and I decided to try my luck on a Thursday evening. The forest was quiet. Middle of the week means fewer people, which is exactly how I like it. I parked my truck at one of the fire roads about half a mile from my usual spot, gathered my gear, and headed in around 4 in the afternoon. The spot I was working is a small clearing with good sight lines, backed by a thicket that provides cover, perfect for setting up a predator call. For those who don't hunt, an electronic predator caller plays sounds that attract predators. In this case, I was using a specialized bobcat distress call that mimics the sound of injured prey. Different calls for different predators. Bears and coyotes typically respond to rabbit distress calls, but I was specifically after bobcat, so I was using a call that's pretty much only effective for them. I got settled in against a large oak around 5:30, just as the light was starting to fade. I was wearing my usual camo, had my .243 with the Vermont scope, and my red filtered hunting light. For those who don't know, predators generally can't see red light, or at least they don't react to it the way they do to white light. It lets you spot them without spooking them. The first hour was uneventful, just the usual forest sounds, birds settling in for the night, the occasional rustle in the underbrush from squirrels or other small game. Around 6:45, I turned on my electronic caller. The volume was set low, just enough to carry maybe 100 yards in each direction. No point in broadcasting to the entire forest. About 10 minutes into the calling sequence, I felt something. I can't really explain it better than that. The hair on my arms stood up, and I had this overwhelming sense that I was being watched. Now, this isn't entirely unusual when you're predator calling. That's kind of the point, to attract predators to your location. But this felt different, heavier somehow. I kept the caller going, but slowly reached for my light and switched it on, scanning the tree line to my right. Nothing, then to my left. Still nothing. I was about to chalk it up to nerves when I heard it. A sort of shuffling sound behind me, maybe 30 yards back in the thicker part of the woods. My first thought was feral hog. We have a ton of them in East Texas, and they can make similar sounds moving through brush, but something felt off about the rhythm of it. It was too deliberate. I slowly turned, keeping my movements minimal, and pointed my red filtered light toward the sound. What I saw still doesn't make sense to me. In the dim red glow of my light, I could make out a large dark shape on all fours. My first thought was bear, which would be unusual but not impossible in Sam Houston. It looked big, easily 300 pounds, maybe more, with a bulky, rounded back and what appeared to be a heavy-set build. But something about the proportions wasn't right. Here's where things got weird. The moment my light hit it, the creature, I don't know what else to call it, immediately reacted, but not like any bear I've ever encountered. It stood up on 2 legs, smoothly, quickly. I've seen black bears stand before. They're awkward when they do it, wobbly. They don't stay up long, and they certainly don't move well in that position. This thing stood easily 6 feet tall, maybe more, and the way it moved was fluid, natural, like standing on 2 legs was its normal way of getting around. The red filter on my light meant I couldn't make out colors or fine details, but I could see the silhouette clearly. It had long arms, proportionally longer than a human's, and a conical-shaped head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, with little or no visible neck. The shoulders were broad and sloped, not squared like a person's. What happened next is what keeps me up at night sometimes. The creature turned and ran, on two legs, and it was fast. Much faster than a person could move through dense woods in the dark. It weaved between trees with a grace that seemed impossible for something that size. As it fled, it started making these sounds. Not growls or roars like you'd expect from a bear or big cat. These were rhythmic, almost like someone trying to talk while out of breath. A series of deep whoops or pulses that carried through the trees. Hoo-hoo-hoop, hoo-hoo-hoop. Over and over, getting fainter as it moved away. I sat there frozen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My predator caller was still going in the background. The bobcat distress call now seeming absurdly insignificant compared to what I'd just witnessed. I don't know how long I sat there, probably only a minute or two, but it felt like forever. Part of me wanted to pack up immediately and get the hell out of there. But another part, the hunter in me, I guess, was curious. I'd never seen anything like this before, and some stupid impulse made me want to know more. I switched off the caller and just listened. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just that rhythmic whooping sound, now distant but still audible. Against my better judgment, I decided to try to get a better look. I slowly stood up, checked my rifle, though I had no intention of shooting at something I couldn't identify, and moved cautiously in the direction the creature had gone. I only made it about 50 yards before stopping. The whooping had ceased, and that silence felt oppressive, heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the smell, a strong, musky odor like wet dog mixed with something else I couldn't place, sour, almost metallic. I swept my red light across the brush ahead of me and caught a glimpse of movement to my left. Just a flash, but it was enough to make me freeze again. Whatever it was circling back around. This realization hit me like a bucket of cold water. I wasn't tracking it, it was tracking me, and that's when I knew I needed to get out. Now, I started backing away slowly, keeping my light pointed in the direction where I'd seen the movement. The red beam cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing but trees and underbrush. I'd made it about halfway back to my original position when I heard a loud crack, like a branch breaking off to my right. I swung the light that way and caught it full in the beam. It was standing upright maybe 20 yards away, partially obscured by a tree, but clearly visible. In that moment, I got a better look at its face. The eyes reflected the red light. Two large round orbs that seemed to glow in the darkness. The face was wrong, not like a bear, not like anything I recognized. It had a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like a flattened nose, almost simian but not quite. For a split second we just stared at each other, then it made a different sound. A deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the air around me. I'd heard bears growl before. I'd heard mountain lions scream. This was different. Lower, more intentional somehow. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked then. I turned and ran, full sprint, back toward the clearing and beyond, heading for the fire road where I'd parked. I could hear it moving through the woods parallel to me, branches snapping, brush rustling. It was keeping pace easily, those whooping sounds starting up again, louder now. I reached the fire road and didn't slow down, just sprinted the half-mile back to my truck. I fumbled with the keys, got in and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The whole time I kept scanning the tree line with my headlights, expecting to see it emerge from the darkness, but it never did. I sat there for probably 15 minutes, engine running, trying to calm down enough to drive. The forest edge remained still and silent. I realized then that I'd left all my gear back at the clearing, my blind, my caller, everything except my rifle and light. There was no way in hell I was going back for it. Not that night. I drove home in a daze, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. It must have been a bear. Had to be. Maybe one with mange or some deformity that made its proportions seem off. Maybe the red light had played tricks on my eyes. Maybe. But deep down, I knew better. I've seen bears. I've hunted them. This wasn't a bear. I went back the next day, in broad daylight, with 2 hunting buddies. I didn't tell them what happened, just that I'd been spooked by something and left my gear. We found everything where I'd left it. There were tracks around the area, large impressions in the soft ground that had been partially obscured by fallen leaves. My friends thought they looked like bear tracks, but they weren't clear enough to be certain. I haven't been back to that part of Sam Houston since. I still hunt, but I stick to areas with more human activity now, and I don't predator call anymore. Not alone, anyway. I've spent hours researching what I might have seen that night. Looked at videos of bears walking on hind legs. Read accounts of other strange encounters in East Texas woods. Nothing quite matches what I experienced. I don't know what was in those woods that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes when I'm half asleep, I still hear those rhythmic whoops echoing through the trees, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. Story 15. I've been sitting on this story for years now, trying to convince myself that I imagined it, or that it was just some weird guy in a costume, or even a bear standing on its hind legs. But I know what I saw that summer day in 2016. And no matter how much I try to rationalize it, nothing else makes sense. I finally need to get this off my chest. I was 15 at the time, living in Hardwick, Vermont. It's this small town surrounded by dense forests and hills, pretty much the middle of nowhere. In the summer, there wasn't much to do except hang out with friends, which is exactly what I was planning that day. My buddy Matt lived about 2 miles from my house, and the quickest way to get there was to follow these old abandoned railroad tracks that cut through the woods. I'd walked those tracks hundreds of times. They were overgrown in spots, but still clear enough to follow easily. My parents always warned me to be careful, not because of wildlife, but just because of the uneven ground and rusty metal. The idea of running into anything dangerous out there never crossed my mind. It was early afternoon, probably around 2 o'clock. The day was hot but not unbearable, and the trees provided decent shade along most of the route. I remember I was wearing my favorite red t-shirt, cargo shorts, and these beat-up Nikes that were falling apart, but I refused to throw away. I had my phone in my pocket and my earbuds in, blasting some music while I walked. I was about halfway to Matt's place when it happened. I wasn't paying much attention to where I was stepping, and my foot caught on one of the railroad ties that had come loose. I stumbled forward, almost falling flat on my face, and yanked my earbuds out in surprise. When I looked up to regain my balance, that's when I saw it. Standing on the tracks, maybe 100 feet ahead of me, was the biggest thing I've ever seen in my life. At first, my brain couldn't even process what I was looking at. It was just this massive shape blocking the path, standing completely upright. It took a few seconds for my eyes to focus and my mind to register what I was seeing. It was covered in this dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but hair, and across its shoulders and upper back, the hair had this reddish tint where the sunlight hit it. The creature was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. I'm terrible at estimating heights, but it had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders and chest were enormous, like 3 feet across at least. What really struck me were its arms. They hung down past its waist, maybe even to its knees. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its head was weird too. It sat directly on its shoulders, like it didn't have a neck at all. I couldn't make out much of its face from that distance, but it looked flat, almost like a gorilla, but different. I didn't see any ears sticking out from the side of its head. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a couple seconds, we stared at each other. I was completely frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. Then it moved, and that broke my trance. It turned suddenly, way more quickly than something that size should be able to move, and climbed up this steep embankment on the side of the tracks. The embankment had to be at least 12 feet high, and this thing scaled it in like 3 steps before disappearing into the trees. My first thought was, holy shit, I just saw Bigfoot, followed immediately by, that's impossible. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, trying to process what had happened, wondering if I should turn around and go home or keep going toward Matt's. Before I could decide, I heard a crash from the tree line. The thing had come back, not all the way onto the tracks, but it had rushed back through the trees toward the edge of the embankment. And then it made this sound, this deep, roaring scream that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, nothing. It was primal and angry and terrifying. It stayed partly hidden in the trees, but started moving along the embankment, parallel to the tracks. It was following me. That's when I really started to panic. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my legs felt like jelly. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. So I did. I took off down the middle of the tracks, running faster than I'd ever run in my life. I could hear it keeping pace with me up on the ridge. It was making these horrifying sounds, deep, growling roars followed by these sharp, angry barks. The whole time, it was crashing through the underbrush, breaking branches and shaking small trees. I caught glimpses of it through the trees as I ran. A massive arm here, the shine of its hair there, but never the whole thing at once. It seemed like it was deliberately staying just far enough back in the trees that I couldn't get a good look at it, but close enough that I knew it was there. It was like it was escorting me off its territory or something. My lungs were burning, and my ankles kept twisting on the uneven railroad ties, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The fear was so overwhelming that nothing else mattered except getting away from that thing. I don't know how long I ran like that. Probably only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. Finally, I reached this clearing where the trees pulled back from the tracks for a while. There was an old maintenance shed or something on one side and an open field on the other. When I got to that clearing, I finally got up the courage to look behind me. Nothing. Complete silence. The crashing in the brush had stopped. The roaring had stopped. There was no sign of the creature at all. It was like it had vanished, or maybe it had just decided not to follow me into the open. I didn't stop to find out. I kept running all the way to Matt's house, constantly looking over my shoulder. By the time I got there, I was drenched in sweat. My legs were shaking, and I could barely breathe. Matt opened the door and immediately asked what the hell had happened to me. I tried to tell him what I'd seen, but even as the words were coming out of my mouth, I could hear how crazy it sounded. I saw Bigfoot on the railroad tracks. Who would believe that? Matt listened, but I could tell from his face that he thought I was either pulling his leg or had seen a bear and freaked out. Dude, there aren't any Sasquatches in Vermont, he kept saying. It was probably a moose or something, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a moose or a bear or a guy in a costume. It moved too naturally, too quickly, and the sounds it made. I've watched videos of bear vocalizations since then, trying to convince myself that's what I heard. But nothing comes close. For weeks after that, I took the long way around to get to Matt's house, adding almost 40 minutes to the walk just to avoid those railroad tracks. When school started back up in the fall, I finally worked up the courage to walk that route again, but only in a group with friends. I didn't walk those tracks alone for over a year. I've told this story to a few people over the years. My parents, who thought I was just letting my imagination run wild. A couple of close friends, who either laughed it off or gave me those, "Are you okay?" looks. And one teacher who seemed genuinely interested, but suggested maybe I'd had a heat stroke and hallucinated the whole thing. I've looked online at Bigfoot sightings in Vermont, and there have been a few reports from the general area over the years. Nothing as close or as clear as what I saw, though. I've thought about reporting it to one of those Bigfoot research groups, but I'm afraid of being laughed at or, worse, Having my name attached to a Bigfoot sighting forever, I can just imagine future employers Googling me and finding that. The thing that still gets me, that I still can't explain, is why it acted the way it did. If it wanted to hurt me, it could have. I was completely vulnerable out there, but instead, it seemed more like it was trying to scare me away, like I had wandered into its territory, and it was making sure I left quickly and didn't come back. Sometimes I think about going back there with a camera, trying to find evidence, footprints, hair caught on tree branches, anything. But then I remember that roar and the way it moved through the forest like it owned it, and I realize I don't want to find it again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I still live in Vermont, though I'm in college now, about an hour from Hardwick. Sometimes when I'm home visiting my parents, I'll look out toward the woods from our backyard and wonder if it's still out there, moving silently through the trees. I wonder if it remembers me, the scared kid running down the railroad tracks, or if I was just one of many humans it's encountered and scared off over the years. One thing's for sure. I never listen to music through earbuds when I'm walking in the woods anymore. I want to hear everything around me, and I always keep my eyes open for movement in the trees. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it either if someone told me this story. But I know what I saw that day. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still hear that roar echoing in my head, and I know that whatever was out there on those tracks was real. It was real, it was angry, and for whatever reason, it let me go. Story 16. I've never shared this before, not fully. It's been 58 years, but I still think about it all the time. I was just 7 years old when my dad died in January of 1966. My mom had passed when I was a baby, so they sent me to live with my older sister Jean and her husband Tom in Warsaw, Ohio. They'd just bought this big old house at the edge of town, right at the bottom of Spring Mountain. That house. God, I hated that house from the minute I saw it. It was this huge 3-story place that used to be a funeral home of all things. Jean thought it was a steal, because no one else wanted to live in a place where they used to prepare dead bodies. I remember the first night I spent there, curled up in my new bedroom with my stuffed bear, listening to all the creaks and groans. I told myself it was just an old house settling, but even at 7 I knew better. It was about 3 weeks after I moved in when it happened. It was a Wednesday afternoon, I remember, because Tom had the day off and was working on fixing the back porch. Jean had given me a bath after lunch because we were supposed to go into town later for some shopping. The bathroom was on the 2nd floor, this cramped little room with yellowing tiles and a clawfoot tub that always felt cold, no matter how hot the water was. I'd just finished my bath and was standing on the little rug, drying myself off with this scratchy towel Jean had given me. The bathroom had this big window that looked out toward the mountain. Jean always said she needed to put curtains up, but she never got around to it. I remember the window was partially fogged up from the bath steam, and I was just standing there shivering a little. Then I felt it, this feeling like I wasn't alone. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck? Like that, but worse. I glanced toward the window, and that's when I saw it. There was a face looking in at me, not just any face, this enormous face that filled the entire window frame. The window wasn't small either. It was maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. The face was pressed right against the glass, and I could see steam forming around I don't even know what to call it, its mouth, its snout. All I know is it was covered in dark, matted hair. Not like a person with a beard, like an animal, but not any animal I'd ever seen. Its eyes are what I remember most. They weren't animal eyes, and they weren't human eyes either. They were somewhere in between, intelligent, focused, staring right at me. They were dark, almost black, but with this reddish-amber glow in the center. The face didn't move at all, it just watched me. I couldn't scream at first. My throat closed up like someone was choking me. I just stood there, naked and dripping, staring back at this thing. Then it blinked, slowly, deliberately. That's when I found my voice. I screamed so loud my throat hurt afterward. I grabbed my towel, wrapped it around me, and ran from that bathroom so fast I slipped on the hallway floor and skinned my knee. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that window, from those eyes. I tumbled down the stairs, still screaming for John. She came running from the kitchen, and Tom burst in from the back door. I was hysterical, trying to tell them about the face at the window while sobbing and shaking. John tried to calm me down, telling me it was probably just a reflection or my imagination, but Tom took it seriously. He grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and went outside to look. While he was gone, Jean sat me down in the kitchen and gave me a cup of hot chocolate, trying to get me to stop shaking. "Kathy, honey," she kept saying, "we're on the second floor. Nobody could look in that window without a ladder." But I knew what I saw. It wasn't a person, I told her through my tears. It was too big. Its face filled the whole window and it was covered in hair, like a monster, but real. Jean got this strange look on her face when I said that. She glanced toward the back of the house, toward Spring Mountain, and then quickly looked away. She didn't say anything else, just held my hand until Tom came back. Tom had searched all around the house and found nothing. No footprints, no ladder, nothing that could explain what I'd seen. "There's no way anyone could have been looking in that window, Kathy," he said, but I could tell he was troubled. He kept looking out the windows toward the tree line that separated our property from the beginning of Spring Mountain. I refused to take baths after that. I wouldn't even go into that bathroom alone. Jean had to stand right outside the door whenever I needed to use the toilet, and I only took quick sponge baths in the downstairs bathroom for weeks after. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept my light on and sat up in bed, staring at my window, even though Jean had triple-checked that it was locked and had hung an extra blanket over it as a makeshift curtain. Around midnight, I heard Jean and Tom talking in low voices in the hallway. "Should we tell her?" Jean was whispering. "No," Tom replied firmly. "She's scared enough as it is. It's probably nothing anyway." "But what about the crying? I heard it again last night, Tom. It doesn't sound like an animal." "It's just coyotes or something. This house is old. It makes noises." "Not like a baby crying, it doesn't." I slipped out of bed and pressed my ear against the door to hear better. "Look," Tom was saying. "People have been telling stories about Spring Mountain for years. You know, it's all just superstition because of the old burial grounds." Jean sighed. "I know, but ever since we moved in, I've been feeling like we're being watched. And now with what Kathy saw." "It was her imagination. She's 7, she just lost her father, and we moved her into an old funeral home. Of course she's seeing things." They moved away from my door then, and I couldn't hear anymore. But I knew what Jean was talking about. The crying. I'd heard it too, late at night, coming from the woods behind our house. It did sound like a baby, but wrong somehow. Too loud, too long without taking a breath. There weren't any houses back there, just woods, and then the mountain. The next morning at breakfast, I asked Jean about Spring Mountain. She tried to change the subject, but I kept pushing. Finally, Tom put down his newspaper. "It's just an old mountain, Kathy," he said. "People say it was a Native American burial ground a long time ago. Some folks in town like to blame anything strange on it." "What kind of strange things?" I asked. Jean shot Tom a warning look, but he continued. "Oh, just silly stuff. Lights in the woods, strange noises. One old-timer at the hardware store told me his grandfather used to talk about mountain giants that would come down during hard winters looking for food." "Tom," Jean snapped, "that's enough." But it was too late. The idea of mountain giants was stuck in my head. That evening, I sat by the living room window that faced the mountain, watching as the sun set behind it and shadows crawled down its slopes toward our house. As darkness fell, I noticed something odd. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, there were patches in the tree line where the shadows seemed wrong, deeper than they should be, and sometimes they seemed to shift even when there was no wind moving the branches. I was about to call Jean when I saw it, movement at the edge of the woods, not small like a deer or a fox, but big. Something large was moving between the trees, staying just inside the tree line. I couldn't make out its shape clearly, but whatever it was tall, taller than Tom, who was over 6 feet. Then I heard the crying. It started soft, almost like a whimper, then rose to a wail that made the hair on my arm stand up. It didn't sound like a baby anymore. It sounded like something trying to imitate a baby, but not getting it quite right. "Jean!" I called, not taking my eyes off the tree line. "Jean, come quick!" She came running in, and Tom was right behind her. "What is it, Kathy?" "There," I pointed toward the woods. "Something's out there and it's making that crying noise you talked about." They both looked where I was pointing, and for a moment we all saw it. A large, dark shape moving between 2 pine trees. John gasped and grabbed my shoulder. Tom went for the back door. "Stay here," he ordered, grabbing his flashlight. "Tom, don't!" John cried, but he was already heading outside. We watched from the window as Tom's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, moving toward the tree line. The crying had stopped as soon as he stepped outside. He reached the edge of the woods and paused, shining his light between the trees. For a few minutes, he searched the area, then turned and walked back to the house, shaking his head. "Probably just a deer," he said when he came back in, but I could tell he didn't believe it. His face was pale, and he locked the door behind him, something he rarely bothered to do. That night, Jean put me to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. Around 11, I heard them arguing downstairs. "We need to tell someone," Jean was saying. "Tell them what?" Tom's voice was strained. "That we think Bigfoot is stalking our house, they'll think we're crazy." "I don't care what it is, Tom. I care that it was looking at my little sister through a 2nd-story window. We don't know that's what she saw. It could have been—" "Don't say her imagination again. I saw it too tonight. Whatever it wasn't natural." Their voices dropped too low for me to hear more, but their words confirmed what I already knew. The face at my window had been real. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, it was the middle of the night, and something had woken me. A sound right outside my window, a soft scratching like fingernails on glass. I froze under my covers, too terrified to move. The scratching continued, gentle but persistent. Then it stopped, and I heard a low, rumbling breath, in and out, like something massive was standing just on the other side of my wall. I wanted to scream for Jean, but no sound would come out. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, so softly I almost missed it, I heard a voice. Not human, not animal. Something in between. A deep, gravelly sound that formed what might have been words, though I couldn't understand them. After that came a thud, like something heavy landing on the ground outside, and then silence. I didn't tell Jean or Tom about that night. Somehow I knew they wouldn't believe me, or worse, they'd believe me and be even more scared than they already were. Instead, I started watching the mountain more carefully, looking for patterns. I noticed that the strange sounds always came 3 or 4 days after heavy rain. The crying would start around dusk and continue until midnight. And sometimes, if I looked very carefully at the tree line as the sun was setting, I could see shapes moving. Tall, broad shapes that walked on 2 legs but didn't move like people. We only lived in that house for 6 more months. Jean told me we were moving because Tom got a better job in Cincinnati, but I overheard them talking about how they couldn't take another winter at the foot of Spring Mountain. The day we moved, as the last boxes were being loaded into the truck, I looked back at the house one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw that face again. Not at a window this time, but peering around the corner of the house, those same eyes watching me. Then Tom called my name, and when I looked back, it was gone. I'm 58 years old now, and I've never been back to Warsaw or Spring Mountain. I still don't know what was watching me that day through the bathroom window. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just my imagination, the trauma of losing my father and moving to a strange new home. But then I remember those eyes, intelligent and ancient, looking at me with what felt like curiosity rather than malice. And I wonder what's still out there, in those dark woods at the foot of Spring Mountain, watching and waiting. Story 17. I've been hesitant to share this experience for a long time. 15 years in the army taught me to trust my senses and remain calm under pressure. But what happened 3 months ago in the Washington wilderness shook me in ways combat never did. After retiring from military service last year, I struggled with the transition to civilian life. The constant noise, the meaningless small talk, the rush of everyday existence, it all felt overwhelming. By April, I needed space to clear my head, so I planned a week-long solo hike in one of the most remote areas of the Cascades. I'd spent plenty of time in rough terrain during my service, so the isolation didn't worry me. In fact, it was exactly what I was looking for. I packed light but thoroughly. My old military habits die hard. Tent, sleeping bag, water filtration, first aid, food rations for 10 days, always pack extra, topo maps, compass, sat phone for emergencies, and my sidearm. I've carried that Glock 19 for years, never thought I'd need it for anything besides maybe a cougar or bear. The first 3 days were perfect. The weather held, cool but not cold, with that clean mountain air that makes your lungs feel like they're working properly for the first time. I followed game trails when they aligned with my route and bushwhacked when necessary. Didn't see another human being, which was exactly the point. Each night, I set up camp before sunset, ate a simple meal, and slept better than I had in months. The silence was therapeutic. Just wind through trees, occasional bird calls, and the white noise of small streams. That all changed on the 4th night. I'd hiked about 15 miles that day, pushing deeper into the backcountry than I'd originally planned. Found a nice spot near a creek around 5 in the afternoon. Flat ground, water source, decent tree cover overhead. Set up my tent, filtered some water, heated my meal, and turned in early. I was physically tired in that good way that only comes from a full day of hiking. Must have fallen asleep immediately. No idea what time it was when I woke up. No moon that night, just absolute darkness. What pulled me from sleep were footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling my campsite. At first I thought bear. I've encountered black bears before, and they'll investigate campsites looking for food, but these steps were different, more rhythmic, more purposeful, 2-legged, not 4, and heavy. Each step made the ground vibrate slightly. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, hand on my Glock, listening. Whatever was out there circled my campsite 3 times, pausing occasionally. Then I heard it handling my gear. I keep my backpack just outside my tent vestibule, covered with a rainfly. There was the sound of zippers, fabric moving, metal clinking against metal. Here's where training kicked in. I knew making sudden movements or confronting whatever was out there in pitch darkness wasn't smart, so I waited, controlling my breathing, finger resting outside the trigger guard of my weapon. Eventually the sounds stopped, and the footsteps faded away. I didn't sleep again that night. First light couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I cautiously unzipped my tent and looked outside. My backpack had been moved about 15 feet from where I'd left it. The contents were scattered in a rough semicircle. My map, compass, some energy bars, cooking pot, even my spare socks. Nothing was damaged, nothing was missing, just examined. I spent a good 30 minutes scanning the tree line, looking for signs of whatever had visited. Found nothing obvious. No tracks in the rocky soil around my campsite, no hair or droppings. but something had definitely been there. I debated ending my trip right then, but stubbornness won out. I told myself it was probably just a particularly bold coyote, or maybe even another hiker playing a weird prank. Deep down, I knew neither explanation made sense. I packed up and hiked another 12 miles that day, constantly looking over my shoulder. By late afternoon, I'd reached a small alpine meadow surrounded by dense pine forest. Beautiful spot, but more exposed than I would have liked after the previous night's experience. Still, daylight was fading, so I set up camp. This time, I arranged my gear differently, kept my backpack inside the tent with me, set up small piles of pebbles around my campsite perimeter that would make noise if disturbed, wedged my cooking pot between two branches so it would clatter if something bumped it. Oldest tricks in the book, but effective. I was determined to stay awake as long as possible, but exhaustion won out eventually. When I woke, it was to the sound of my makeshift alarms, pebbles scattering, pot clanging. I checked my watch, 2:17 in the morning. Gripping my flashlight in my left hand and my Glock in my right, I listened. The footsteps were back, heavier than before if that was possible. Whatever it was seemed larger in this new location, as if it had brought friends or grown overnight. But there was still something methodical about the movement. This wasn't an animal randomly foraging. I made a decision, unzipped my tent slowly and poked just my head out. The beam of my tactical flashlight caught a massive shadow hunched over my cooking area about 20 feet away. When the light hit it, it froze. Didn't run, didn't charge, just stopped moving completely. Slowly, it turned toward me. I've faced enemy combatants. I've stared down the barrel of a gun pointed at me, but nothing prepared me for what I saw when that thing turned around. It stood at least 8 feet tall. Not a bear rearing up, not a person on stilts, a bipedal creature covered in dark, matted fur. Its shoulders must have been 3 feet across, with long arms hanging down past its knees. The face is what haunts me, though. Not quite human, but disturbingly close. Heavy brow ridge, deep-set eyes that caught my flashlight and reflected back with an amber glow. A wide, flat nose and a mouth set in what looked like a permanent grimace. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. My hand was rock steady on my weapon, another gift from military training, but my mind was reeling. This thing wasn't in any wildlife manual I'd ever studied. The creature made no aggressive moves. It just studied me with what I can only describe as curiosity. Then, deliberately, it placed my metal cup, which it had been holding, back on the ground, straightened to its full height, and began backing away, not running, not charging, just a calm, controlled retreat into the tree line. It never took its eyes off me until the darkness swallowed it completely. I stayed frozen in position for at least 30 minutes, flashlight trained on the spot where it had disappeared. Every survival instinct told me to pack up and get moving, but rational thought reminded me that stumbling through unfamiliar wilderness in the dark was a recipe for disaster. So I waited until dawn, every muscle tense, every sound amplified in my hyper-aware state. When morning finally came, I immediately broke camp, leaving my coffee unmade and breakfast uneaten. Before I left, I checked the area where the creature had stood. The ground there was softer, and what I found sent ice through my veins. Footprints, huge footprints, pressed deep into the soil, nearly twice the size of my own boot prints next to them. They had 5 distinct toes and an arch like a human foot, but the scale was all wrong. I took photos with my phone, using my boot for scale. Then I got the hell out of there. My original plan had been to spend 3 more days in the backcountry, but I abandoned that immediately. I needed to get back to my truck, back to civilization. The hike out should have taken 2 full days, but I pushed hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary. The entire way back, I felt watched. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just days before now felt oppressive. Several times I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something large keeping pace with me through the trees, never close enough to see clearly, always just at the edge of perception. Occasionally I'd hear rustling that didn't match the wind patterns or heavy steps that would stop as soon as I turned toward them. By mid-afternoon, I was moving at a near jog when terrain allowed, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The rational part of my brain kept saying I was overreacting, but 15 years of combat-honed instincts told me I was being followed, not hunted, but definitely monitored. As I got closer to the trailhead, the sense of being watched gradually diminished. The last 5 miles I felt alone again, as if whatever had been following me had reached the boundary of its territory and was satisfied I was leaving. I reached my truck just before sunset, threw my gear in the back, and drove 3 hours straight to the nearest motel. Didn't even stop for food. It's been 3 months now. I've researched everything I can find about the area and similar reports. I've looked at thousands of alleged Bigfoot sightings and accounts. Some match elements of what I experienced, but nothing captures the intelligent, deliberate nature of my encounter. I've told exactly 2 people about this. My former platoon sergeant, who just nodded and said he'd heard similar stories from his grandfather, who was native to the Pacific Northwest, and my therapist, who was professional enough not to outright call me delusional. I haven't been back to the woods since then. Not sure when I will be. The thing is, I'm not scared of whatever I saw, not exactly. What unsettles me more is having to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the world. If that creature exists, what else might be out there, just beyond the edge of our awareness? I can't explain what I encountered in those Washington woods. All I know is that something intelligent, something not officially recognized by science, watched me, studied me, and escorted me out of its territory. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep at night, I swear I can hear those heavy, deliberate footsteps circling my house. Nditon, Story 18. Asashi, I still don't know what we saw that day. It's been 3 months and I've checked every local news outlet, every Oregon Bigfoot forum, even called a couple radio stations anonymously. Nothing. How does something like that happen with multiple witnesses and nobody talks about it? This happened back in August, on a Friday evening. My buddy Jake and I were heading out to the coast for the weekend, driving westbound on Highway 26, just outside Portland. We'd both gotten off work early, around 5 o'clock, grabbed our camping gear, and hit the road. Traffic had been heavy getting out of the city, but finally thinned out once we got past the suburbs. It was about 7:30 in the evening, still plenty of daylight left. That stretch of Highway 26 is pretty much surrounded by dense forest on both sides. We were just cruising along, talking about which campsite we'd try to snag, when I noticed a car pulled over in the eastbound emergency lane with its hazards flashing. Nothing too unusual about that. People pull over all the time with car trouble. But what was weird was how the car ahead of us suddenly swerved and then floored it. Like this wasn't a little correction. They jerked the wheel hard and accelerated like they'd seen something terrifying. What the hell was that about? Jake asked. I slowed down a bit, thinking maybe there was something in the road, a deer, some debris, whatever. Highway 26 isn't exactly known for its great shoulders, so I was being cautious. That's when it happened. From the tree line on the north side of the road, the right side from our westbound perspective, something burst out of the woods. At first, my brain couldn't even process what I was seeing. It was big, dark, and moving fast. Holy shit, Jake yelled, and I instinctively hit the brakes, not hard enough to skid, but enough to slow us down significantly. This thing was crossing the road diagonally behind us. I caught it clearly in my side mirror and also got a glimpse of it through my peripheral vision when it was maybe 10 feet from our car. It was massive, easily 6 feet tall, maybe more, with this broad, muscular frame that no human has. It wasn't running upright like a person would. It was hunched forward, using its arms as part of its movement, kind of like how gorillas run, but way more coordinated and faster. The way it moved was what freaked me out the most. It would plant its hands or knuckles down as part of its stride, propelling itself forward with this powerful bounding motion. Not like a person on all fours, more like its arms were too long for its body and it needed to use them for balance and speed. The thing was covered in dark hair, brownish black, not pure black, and it wasn't patchy or mangy like a sick bear. This was thick, uniform hair covering its entire body. Its arms were insanely long, and its chest and shoulders were just massive, like a bodybuilder, but proportioned all wrong. The head is what convinced me this wasn't a person in a suit. It sat low on the shoulders, almost like there wasn't a neck at all. I didn't get a great look at the face, but what I saw wasn't human. It was more like an animal face, but not quite like any animal I've seen before. The whole thing happened so fast, maybe 5 seconds, from when it emerged to when it disappeared into the woods on the south side of the road. But in those 5 seconds, my entire understanding of what's possible got completely shattered. Jake and I just sat there for a moment, the car crawling forward at maybe 15 miles per hour. Neither of us said anything for what felt like an eternity. "Did you?" I finally managed to say. "Yeah," Jake cut me off. "I saw it." His voice was shaking. I've known Jake since high school, and I've never heard him sound scared like that. "That car behind us almost hit it," I said, looking in the rearview mirror. Sure enough, there was another westbound car that had slowed down dramatically, just like we had. I could see the driver's face, even from a distance. Pure shock. So that's at least 3 vehicles that witnessed this thing crossing the road. Us, the car that had pulled over with its hazards on, who was probably pulled over because of seeing this thing, and the car behind us that nearly hit it. I pulled over to the shoulder, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The car behind us slowed down as it passed. The driver, a middle-aged guy with a baseball cap, staring at us with wide eyes. He didn't stop, though. "Should we call someone?" Jake asked, already pulling out his phone. "Who?" "The police. And tell them what? We saw Bigfoot." I couldn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. I'd always been the skeptical one. I'd rolled my eyes at all those History Channel documentaries and YouTube videos of grainy footage in the woods. "It wasn't a bear," Jake said firmly. "Bears don't move like that." "No, they don't," I agreed, trying to make sense of what we'd just witnessed. "And it wasn't a person either." "Too big," Jake nodded. "Way too big." We sat there for maybe 5 minutes trying to process. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. There's this weird sense of unreality that sets in when you see something that shouldn't exist. Your brain keeps trying to find some normal explanation, but nothing fits. "Let's go look," Jake suddenly suggested, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Are you insane?" I asked, grabbing his arm. "What if it's still there?" "That's kind of the point," he said. "We just saw Bigfoot, man. Bigfoot. We should at least check for tracks or something." Part of me knew he was right. This was potentially a once-in-a-lifetime thing. But another part, the primal, survival-oriented part, was screaming that getting out of the car was the stupidest idea possible. 5 minutes, I finally agreed. We looked for 5 minutes, then we're back in the car. We got out cautiously, both of us scanning the tree line like we expected that thing to come charging back out. The spot where it had crossed was maybe 50 yards behind us now. We walked back along the shoulder, keeping our eyes on the forest the entire time. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows through the trees. Every movement in the branches made my heart skip. I've never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. When we reached the approximate spot where it had crossed, we peered into the woods on both sides of the highway. The ground on the shoulder was too hard-packed to show footprints, but at the edge where it transitioned to forest, the soil was softer. "There!" Jake pointed, crouching down at the forest edge on the south side, where the creature had disappeared. I squatted beside him, and sure enough, there was a clear indentation in the soft ground. It was large, much larger than any human footprint, and had a strange shape, wider at the front with what looked like toe impressions. Not like a bear print either. Bears have distinct pad marks and claw indentations. This was something else entirely. "We need a picture," I said, reaching for my phone with shaking hands. Just as I was about to take a photo, we heard something that made both of us freeze. A deep, resonant sound came from within the forest. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something in between. It was loud enough to hear clearly over the occasional passing car, and it didn't sound like any animal I recognize. Following that was the distinct sound of branches breaking, like something large was moving through the underbrush. Jake and I didn't even speak. We just looked at each other, eyes wide, and then both sprinted back to the car. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like rubber by the time I yanked the driver's door open and threw myself inside. Jake was right behind me, slamming his door shut. I locked the doors instinctively, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway so fast, I'm surprised we didn't get rear-ended. For the next 15 minutes, we drove in complete silence, both of us constantly checking the mirrors as if expecting to see that thing running after us down the highway. "We should report this," Jake finally said, once we'd put several miles between us and the sighting location. "To who?" I asked, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know. Forest Service? Department of Fish and Wildlife? There's got to be someone who handles this." We ended up calling the local sheriff's department when we got to our campsite. The deputy who took our call was professional but clearly skeptical. He said he'd make a note of it, but didn't seem particularly concerned or interested. No one ever followed up with us. The next morning, we drove back to the spot in daylight. The footprint was gone, either washed away by overnight rain or deliberately obscured. I don't know. There was no evidence anything unusual had happened there. For weeks afterward, I checked every local news source I could find. Nothing. I even called a couple of radio stations anonymously, asking if anyone else had reported seeing something strange on Highway 26 that evening. Nothing. What bothers me most isn't just that we saw something impossible. It's that others saw it too, at least 2 other drivers, and yet there's been complete silence. No reports, no viral videos, nothing. In an age where everyone has a camera and weird news spreads like wildfire, how does something like this stay hidden? I keep replaying those few seconds in my mind, the way it moved, those impossibly long arms, the raw power in its stride, the complete wrongness of its proportions. No costume could mimic that movement or that physiology. It was real, it was alive, and it was nothing I can explain. 3 months later, I still take different routes when I need to head to the coast. I've become that person who jumps at shadows in the woods and keeps their high beams on while driving through forested areas at night. Jake won't talk about it anymore. Says he's trying to forget it happened. But I can't forget. I know what I saw. I just don't understand why nobody else is talking about it.